Next stories. The midnight phone call that saved her life. It was a winter night in the Bitterroot Valley of western Montana, the kind of cold that stiffens breath into silver and makes porch steps protest with tiny cries. In a rented cabin outside the town of Hamilton, tucked between cottonwoods and a creek sealed in dull ice, Ione Merriweather sat at a narrow pine table with a half-finished letter and a cup of black tea gone cool. The clock on the wall ticked like a faraway metronome. She rubbed the heel of her palm across her eyebrow and tried to find the next sentence. Outside, the wind moved cautiously through the trees. A plow grumbled on the distant highway, then faded. A coyote called once and was answered by another, then the night stitched itself shut again. Ione reached for the mug, grimaced at the chill taste, and glanced at the oven where a slice of apple pie waited beneath a loose tent of foil. She had told herself she would not eat it. She told herself she would sleep before 1. She told herself many things. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? She was 32 and between lives. The move from Spokane to Montana had been abrupt, the result of a downsized nonprofit and a relationship that had turned into two courteous strangers sharing a calendar. She had taken a temporary job cataloging land use records at the county archive, which kept her immersed in maps and signatures and the quiet logic of deeds. The cabin was cheap because it was isolated and old, and the owner had warned her. Drafty, you will hear the wind, he had said. But it is an honest wind. She set down her pen and listened. The honest wind seemed to be asleep. The letter was for her sister Sable, who lived in El Paso with twin boys and a border collie that yodeled. Ione wanted to write something steady and reassuring. I am fine. The mountains are large enough to lean against. The work is dull in a kind way. The people at the archives say hello without trying to enter your life like an uninvited guest. She wanted to say she felt temporary, but not in danger. She wanted to say she was learning to like the sound of her own name spoken out loud in an empty room. On the table lay a little stack of things that did not belong to her life yet, but might. A flyer for a community potluck at the Grange Hall, a business card for a place that fixed cracked windshields, a folded trail map with a crease right through a lake named Lost Horse. She touched the map as if smoothing it could also smooth everything else. The phone lay face down beside the tea. She had turned the ringer off at sunset. Too many scam calls had trained her to expect intrusions, and she guarded the hours after 10 like a fisherman guarding a quiet cove. She liked the hush of that choice. In the hush, she felt small and exact, a needle in cloth, a thread pulled clean. The oven, warm from the pie, clicked as metal settled. A thin whine threaded the cabin. She assumed it was the wind curling through the chimney. Midnight slid its pale hand across the roof. At 12 minutes past midnight, when the night feels like a held breath, the phone buzzed against the wood with a low insect murmur. Ione flinched. She had forgotten to set it to silent all the way. She reached for it, meaning to flip it over and ignore whatever nonsense had found her number, then froze when she saw the name glowing through a faint smear of tea. Deputy Calder Boone. She had met him 2 weeks ago at the archive when he came to pick up survey plats for a property dispute. He was quiet, brown-eyed, with windburned cheeks, and the kind of politeness that seemed carved by habit rather than show. He had asked if the old indexes were as bad as people said. She had laughed and told him the bad was consistent, which made it almost good. They had spoken for maybe 5 minutes. He had left a card with a number in case, he said, she ever needed help out by the creek, where cell towers sometimes played shy. Now, his name pulsed on the dark screen. Her stomach made a small, ridiculous leap. She swiped to answer. Ione, he said. His voice carried urgency wrapped in calm. Are you at the cabin right now? Yes. She pressed her palm against the table as if to hold the room steady. Is everything all right? Listen, he said. There's a wildfire flare-up on the ridge west of you. It's not large, but the wind shifted and we've got concern about embers. We're contacting folks along the lower creek. Can you step outside for a moment and tell me what you smell? A laugh almost rose and fell away. It was winter. Fire season was months behind them, yet in the year 2019, the seasons had learned new tricks. and in Montana, even February could smolder after an unseasonable thaw. She slid back the chair and stood. The cabin swayed under her, a strange tilt that had nothing to do with wind. She chided herself for the thought and moved to the door. "Hold on," she said. "I'll check." She opened the door and was met by air so cold it felt musical. Snow edged the steps like braided lace. Above, the sky was a scatter of powder stars. The scent that struck her first was the clean mineral smell of frozen water. Then, faint but definite, came a thread of smoke. "Yes, I smell it," she whispered. "Pine smoke. Distant." "Any other odor?" he asked. "Something like plastic or chemicals." She inhaled, slow. Her breath plumed and thinned. Behind the smoke there was something else, a metallic sweetness like pennies melted on a stovetop. "There's another smell," she said. "I don't like it." "All right," said Boone. "That might be your cabin. Listen carefully. Do you have a carbon monoxide detector?" "Yes, but it's old," she said. "I was going to buy a new one on payday." "Is it chirping?" "No." He exhaled once, as if calculating. "I want you to do this right now. Hang up, call 911 from outside, and wait for firefighters. Do not go back in. Carbon monoxide can make you sleepy before it makes you sick. Your oven was on earlier, wasn't it?" A blush of shame touched her cheeks. "I baked a pie," she said quietly. "Left the oven door open for warmth. The landlord said it was fine." "I know folks do that," he said, his tone neither scolding nor permissive. "But if your chimney draw is funny tonight and embers are in the air, you could have a backdraft or a blocked flue. Please, Ione, outside. Now." Her eyes stung, not from smoke, but from the sudden awareness that the room behind her had held a hidden river with her name in it. She stepped onto the porch, phone clamped to her ear. "I'm out," she whispered. The stars looked like nails hammered into the black. "Good," he said softly. "Stay where you are. I've already called it in. I'm on my way too, but the engine will get there first." The line clicked and went dead because she had followed instructions and dialed 911. Her voice to the dispatcher sounded to her like a voice thrown across a field. She gave the address, the landmarks, the description of the smoke smell, and the faint metallic sweet. The dispatcher told her help was coming from town. "Stay out of the house. Stay on the line if you need to." She thanked the voice and ended the call because she wanted both hands free to hold the night. The cabin windows glowed with the mild gold of a lamp she had left on. The glow looked harmless, like kindness. She knew better now. She wrapped her scarf tighter and tucked her chin. In the creek bed, a fox moved along the ice with the poise of a thought. She tried to focus on that. She tried to focus on anything other than the what if that yawned at her feet like a ditch. Minutes passed. She could not count them and did not want to. In the distance came the small, urgent harmonies of a siren. She put her hand against the porch post and murmured thank you to whatever thread had led Boone to call at that precise slice of night. She imagined him in a squad truck staring at a map, chewing the inside of his cheek, frowning at wind readings, dialing her number because something in his chest said, "Do it now." The engine turned into the drive with a bustle of light. Two firefighters stepped down, steam lifting from their mouths. Their names were embroidered over their heavy coats. R. J. Pickett, L. Havilar. They were both younger than she had expected. Their faces were intent without being hard. "You the caller?" asked Pickett. His eyes swept the cabin, then the sky. Ione nodded. "Carbon monoxide, maybe? I left the oven open earlier. I'm sorry." "No need to be sorry for calling," he said. "That's the right move." Havilar, already shouldering a meter, asked where the detector was. "Kitchen," said Ione, feeling foolish as she pointed at the door like it was an accusation. The firefighters slipped inside in a practice sequence, propped the door, and began. Cold air poured across Ione's ankles. She stood as if correctly placed by invisible tape. She heard one of the meters chirp in a voice that did not sound frantic so much as serious. Pickett's voice called out a number that meant nothing and everything to her. Then came the scrape of a window sash and the clatter of another. The cabin exhaled. After a long minute, both firefighters emerged, and shut the door with a gentleness that surprised her. "You did the right thing," Pickett said. "Levels are high. Your flue is blocked. Looks like a little ember drifted down and lodged where it met some creosote, then the wind did its strange dance. We found the detector on a shelf with the battery pulled halfway, probably chirped at some point and got silenced. Happens." Ione blinked. "I was there at the table," she whispered. "I felt sleepy. I thought it was just the hour." "That's how it goes," Havilar said. Soft as sleep. "Lucky," he called. As if summoned, a county truck pulled up behind the engine, and Calder Boone stepped into the headlight spill. He wore his uniform under a quilted jacket. Snow salted his hairline. He nodded to the firefighters, then looked to Ione, his expression careful, as if any sudden kindness might tip her over. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. "I think so," she said. "Thank you for calling. Thank you for not waiting for morning." "I had your number from the archive," he said. "We were going down a list of addresses. The wind maps were making me itchy. When I saw yours, I figured I'd check personally. Good thing I did." Her chest loosened in a jagged rush. For a moment, she could not speak. She wanted to tell him that her letter to Sable had been about learning to believe in small kindnesses. She wanted to tell him that his voice had carried a bridge to her. Instead, she said quietly, "I'm going to make coffee for all of you when it's safe to go back in." Pickett smiled with his eyes. "We won't say no," he said, "but we'll need to air it out longer. We'll bring in a fan. We'll get your flue brush tomorrow, too, and we'll swap that detector for a new one tonight. County keeps a few for moments like this." The fan roared like a plane trying to lift. The cabin windows steamed and cleared. Ione stood beside Boone on the snow and watched the night reshuffle its deck. She felt exposed and protected at once. She became aware of the way her hands trembled, then settled. "Do you live far?" she asked after some quiet. "Up the road a stretch," Boone said. "My mother keeps a small place near Skalkaho. She's been worried about the winter burns. I told her to sleep. Guess I was telling myself a story." "Do you always listen to your stories?" she asked, and winced at how that sounded. But he laughed softly. "Not always," he said. "Tonight I listened." The minutes unfolded, the fan subsided, Havilar returned with a new detector and installed it high on the wall with practiced movements. When she tested it, the beep startled the room into alertness. Ione felt a sudden fierce affection for that ordinary sound. Pickett gave her instructions in a voice that made the instructions feel like a promise. Crack a window, even in cold snaps. Never use the oven to heat. If the detector chirps, treat it like a shout. Call, then leave. She nodded after each item and repeated it back so the words would settle in her mouth. "Coffee," she said, once they had pronounced the room safe again and the door closed on the fan's silly tail. "Please, let me." She brewed it strong, the way her father in Kansas had always brewed it on calving nights. The steam rose in simple columns. She poured into thick, chipped mugs that had lived in the cabin longer than she had. She brewed it strong, the steam rose in cent again, ne be brewed it Mugsested, and dead did proud on God. She added apple pie slices to paper plates and set them on the table, feeling extravagant and grateful. The three sat and drank and ate with the quiet concentration of people who understand that food can be a kind of ceremony. "To the year 2019, Boone said after a while, raising his mug a fraction. May it behave itself a little more gently than it has started. To detectors that shout," said Havilar. "To wind that minds its manners," said Pickett. "To small stories that save us," Ione said, and she did not mind how earnest she sounded. When the firefighters left, their taillights stitched a red thread down the drive. Boone lingered on the porch step. The sky had begun to frost toward a paler shade. The horizon wore a smudge that suggested morning would eventually remember its job. "I'll check on you tomorrow around noon," Boone said. "Not to bother you, just to make sure the flu's been serviced and your head feels clear." "I'll be here," she said. "The archive can spare me for a day. Mr. Wilkes has a tender spot for near misses. He told me once that his wife decided to marry him because a stranger yanked her out of a sinking canoe." Boone smiled, a small ripple. "That's a good story to borrow," he said. "Sleep with a window open, if you can bear it." "I will," she said. "And thank you again." He nodded once and went down the steps. She watched the county truck disappear, then stood a moment more and let the porch creak speak the honest truth of wood and coal. Inside, the cabin felt new to her, as if another woman had lived there and left in a rush, leaving the lamp on and the pie knife half tucked under a plate and a letter unfinished on the table. She walked from room to room, touching the edges of things, opening the window by a thumb's width, listening for any hint of the sly, sweet odor that had nearly taken her. There was none. Only the faint trace of coffee and cinnamon and snow. She sat at the table and drew the letter closer. The pen felt heavier and kinder than before. She wrote to Sable in straightforward lines. Tonight, a man I barely know called at 12 minutes past midnight and told me to step outside. He saved my life, and I am not being dramatic. The firefighters were named Pickett and Havilar, and I loved them a little on sight, which feels like a confession, but I will not cross it out. There is a new alarm on the wall, and it sings the truth. I have been reminded that you can begin again on any night, even one that smells like smoke. If I sound unsteady, it is because I am grateful, and my chest has not decided where to put the feeling. Her hand steadied as she wrote. She told Sable about the fox and the fan, about the way Boone's voice had reached her like a rope across a dark stretch. She told her about the pie offered like a benediction, about the world that had tilted while she wasn't looking, and then corrected itself with a thunk. She did not try to make it pretty, she tried to make it true. At last, she set the pen down. The clock ticked. The window let in a fraction of star. She rinsed the mugs and plate and left them to dry. She turned off the oven and turned on the new alarm again just to watch its tiny light witness the room. She pulled quilts up to her chin and listened to the creak's muffled language. When sleep came, it wasn't the heavy sleep of carbon monoxide, but the clean tiredness that follows relief. She dreamed of safe doorways and a phone that vibrated exactly when it should. Morning arrived as a wash of nickel and then gold. The world looked rearranged and also exactly the same. She made toast and stood in the doorway with a mug. A jay scolded just enough to be funny. A truck passed on the highway with chains that sang. Around noon, Boone returned with a chimney sweep whose last name was Lemieux and whose hat looked older than both of them. They showed her the chunk of creosote shaped like a broken bow and told her never again to use the oven to heat a room. She promised. She meant it all the way down. They left the cabin smelling like ash and peppermint oil and something else she wanted to call an unfrightened beginning. In the weeks that followed, the archive became more than a quiet job. It became a hearth of its own, a place where she learned how land remembers people even when people pretend otherwise. She found a rhythm. She drove up to Lost Horse on Sundays and watched ice depart the lake with the uncertain bravery of a first step. She learned the names of neighbors who waved from trucks and learned which store in town sold the good bread. She learned to trust the alarm when it chirped at a low battery and did not silence it with a shrug. She replaced the batteries early and kept spares in a drawer with the tea. From time to time, she and Boone crossed paths. At the farmer's market, when spring decided to tent over the valley with pale green light, at the Grange Hall, where someone always brought a casserole that could solve an argument simply by existing. Their conversations were not grand or complicated. They held the place that a porch light holds, dependable and gentle. When he asked how she was, she said fine and meant it. When she asked how his mother was, he said persnickety and pleased and also meant it. They did not name the night often. It hung between them like a small flag sewn into the seam of the day. One evening in early summer, with thunderheads building like cathedrals over the Sapphire Range, she found herself on the same trail as Boone near a meadow where a lupine nodded as if agreeing with some quiet music. They walked together for a while without deciding to. A hawk drew a circle in the sky, folded its wings, and fell. When it rose again, it rose empty and unbothered. I've been thinking about that call, she said at last, not because it haunted me, but because it didn't. It returned to me like a kindness I hadn't expected and then accepted without fuss. That seems like a thing to build a year on. He was quiet for a span. Then he said, I'm glad you answered. Sometimes the phone rings and nobody picks up, and I get to a driveway too late, and the night has already made its choice. It's a strange job carrying those choices in my pocket. You carried one for me, and it emptied itself like a pail, she said softly. I don't know how to thank you for that without making it heavy. Light is fine, he said. Light is best. They reached the edge of the meadow and turned. The Thunderheads hoarded their electricity and then chose to share, but not yet. The smell of rain walked ahead of the rain like an introduction. Back at the cabin, much later, Ione stood in the doorway again with a mug and no fear of the oven and a gratitude that did not need to be narrated. The alarm sat on its wall, trilling a small test song once a month at noon, and when it did, she smiled. She had hung a photograph of the creek by the table, taken on a morning when the water wrote blue cursive over stones. The letter to Sable had been mailed. A reply sat on the counter with 2 crayon drawings of a collie who looked like a parade. That night, as lightning stitched briefly from ridge to ridge and the smell of rain became rain, the phone lay face up on the table. It did not buzz. It did not need to. The cabin breathed evenly. The wind kept to its honest work. Somewhere a fox praised the dark in its own language. And when she finally turned off the lamp, the room held her the way a well-made chair holds a tired person, not gripping, not insisting, only steady. The midnight phone call had already done what it came to do. It had opened a door at 12 minutes past midnight and asked her to live. She had stepped through and closed it gently behind her. And outside the thin drape of the rain, the mountains stood where they had always stood, old companions in no hurry to explain anything at all. Next stories. They found remains under the haunted playground. The first report came just after dusk, when the cicadas were lifting their dry chorus, and the little green ball lying under the maple looked brighter than it should. Maria Qualls, who had walked past the playground behind Hibbard Elementary for years, called the non-emergency line and told the dispatcher that something was wrong with the ground under the seesaws. It had a sound, she said, a hollow breath, a thud like a door closing far away. By the time the sheriff's cruiser eased into the gravel lot, the sky over Hornbeam County, West Virginia, had taken on the bruised blue of late October. It was the year 2015, a year that still felt new to Maria because her husband had died in late spring, and everything afterward had a ring of strangeness, like the world had been moved half an inch to the left without telling anyone. Deputy Thaddeus Crow stepped out of the car and tipped his hat. He carried the patient smile of a man who had been called to the same playground for teenagers drinking, for owls mistaken as prowlers for a nest of hornets that turned out to be an irritable teacher stapling flyers to a board. "Show me," he said. Maria led him past the flaking merry-go-round and the swings that sang on their chains even in the gentlest breeze. She was slight and barefoot, the kind of person who wore grief like a sweater. When she reached the seesaw, she didn't climb onto the plank. She simply lifted her hand, palm down, and held it over the dirt, the way you test for heat on a stovetop. "There," she whispered. "There, listen." At first, there was only wind and the faraway hush of tires on the county road. Then the deputy heard it too, a cough of air, a hollow thump, the faintest scrape. He told himself it was probably a muskrat tunnel caving in or an underground pipe settling. But he knelt, pressed his ear to the earth, and felt the ground answer with a dull heartbeat. Enough to make him call the sheriff. Enough to keep them both there, breathing shallow, while the sun went down behind the cedar line and the first stars needled through. The sheriff, Callum Breck, arrived with a second cruiser and a pair of portable floodlights. Callum was a broad man with a careful manner and a fondness for coffee that smelled like burnt caramel. He listened, nodded, and said they would need the maintenance supervisor from the school district to authorize any digging. Rules were rules. Maria was not a woman to press her luck, but she stepped forward and spoke quietly. "Sheriff," she said, "there are children who play here at First Bell. If something is alive down there, it will not last the night." The wind pushed through the ornamental grasses and set the swing chains clinking, little metronomes in the dark. The sheriff hesitated for only a breath. Then he signaled to Deputy Crow and set the floodlights on their stands. He told the deputy to fetch shovels. He radioed the dispatch and said, "Send Calhoun Voss if you can reach him. The maintenance man will want to know what we are doing, and if we find a busted pipe, I will need his help." The playground had been built in the year 1973, when the town was flush with mill money and believed that future decades would be an easy downhill coast. The slide was steel and the seesaw was heavy oak, and the family who donated the money asked for no plaque. There had been whispers for years, of course. Any place where sunlight and laughter gather will cast its own long shadows. Teachers said the ground there was always a touch colder. Children said a dog sometimes appeared under the slide and then vanished. The crossing guard, Ione Derry, swore that she once saw fresh shoe prints leading to the fence and stopping dead at the third post, as if the walker had simply chosen to rise into the air and keep going. That night, though, there were only 4 living people in the playground: Maria, Deputy Crow, Sheriff Breck, and after a hard 15 minutes of ringless calls, Calhoun Voss, who arrived with a bundle of tools and a roll of flagging tape tucked under his arm. Calhoun was the sort of man who could coax a burned-out boiler back to life with nothing but a ball-peen hammer and a string of apologies. He was also, as it turned out, the only person who knew what lay beneath the swing set. Not at first, he didn't say it. At first, he stood in the floodlight glare and took off his cap and scratched the top of his head. He listened to the thump, thump under the soil and said, "That is not a pipe." He looked at the ground the way a hunter looks at a thicket. Then his jaw worked, and he tugged his cap down again, and he said, "Gentlemen, ma'am, I should tell you something." The shovels bit into the earth, dirt came up and squared off cakes. The smell was the clean mineral smell of riverbanks, the smell of something long sealed and now let loose. Crows sounded from the cedar line, and one fox moved in the ditch with a whisper of legs. Maria stood on the gravel and whispered a prayer she had learned as a child, the one that asks for a light upon dark waters. Calhoun cleared his throat. When the school board won its grant to expand the cafeteria last summer, they sent me the old blueprints, he said. There was a note from 1961 about a root cellar left over from a farmhouse that stood here. The builder swore it was filled and capped, but the notation had a question mark. I meant to check it before winter, see if the cap had sunk. I did not expect this. Deputy Crow's shovel struck something with a sound like a knuckle on a wooden door. He froze, both hands white on the handle. Sheriff Breck knelt and brushed away soil with his broad palm. The floodlight made everything bright and colorless. The wood they uncovered was old and slatted, not a coffin, a hatch. They all realized it at once, and the silence that followed had a shape. It was not empty. It was the kind of silence you feel in your chest, like standing in the doorway of a vacant house and understanding that the house knows you are there. Sheriff Breck swallowed and turned to Maria, and she understood, and she nodded, and she said, "Open it." Calhoun had a pry bar in his roll. He jammed it under the rim of the hatch and leaned his weight onto it. The wood let out a tired sigh and lifted an inch, then 2. A breath came up from below, cool and mineral, and carrying a second smell, one that seized their throats. Not rot exactly, not the sweet sour of a dead animal. More like old pennies and mildew, the odor of a closet that has not been opened since the autumn your youngest child left home. The hatch came free enough to swing aside. Floodlight pooled down into a square of black. The deputy reached for his flashlight and clicked it on and tossed a spear of light. It found stone walls, tight-fitted. It found wooden steps gone soft with damp. It found a dirt floor, and on that floor it found bones. Maria's breath hitched. She put her hand to her mouth and let it rest there. The deputy was young enough to be her son, too young to be so practiced at not letting his face tell. Sheriff Breck counted quietly under his breath while his heart thudded like a shoe in a dryer, because that was how he kept control. Calhoun leaned on his heels and said, "Lord forgive me, I should have checked the cap in summer." The bones were in 2 distinct arrangements. One was a neat shape, a person laid carefully, arms crossed, skull turned so the face looked toward the steps and the square of light. The other was a scatter, as if the second person had been spilled from a bag while the first watched, unable to move. There were small bones mixed in among the second set, bird bones and the narrow stick bones of a fox or cat, and a small round bead that might once have been blue. "This is a crime scene," the sheriff said, because he needed to say something. He radioed for the medical examiner and for the state lab, and then, after a pause, for the coroner from Oak Hollow, because the man in Hornbeam had a habit of arriving tired and leaving careless. The radio hissed and answered. The sheriff repeated the address and the landmarks twice. Then he clicked it off and sat on his heels and stared into the square of earth. Time, right then, did not rush. It took its old, slanted stroll. It let crickets speak and a faraway train give its lonely two-note call. It let the moon climb and adjust its shawl of cloud. It let the floodlights hum. And while time was taking itself, Maria whispered, "Do you hear it?" They were about to say they heard nothing when all three men felt the same faint pressure behind the eyes, the way you feel a new front coming in before the weather changes. Then a breath moved up from the cellar and formed words that were not sound. It was a telling, not heard, but known, a current in the blood. A farmhouse stood here, the telling said. A family lived here who carried strange luck. The father was called Ephraim, the mother was called Isabel. Their eldest girl was Una, and Una had a shadow that clung to her even at noon when the sun was at its fiercest. The neighbors liked Isabel's bread and loved her kitchen chair with the woven seat, but they did not like Una's shadow, which made the butter clabber and the cat drag its belly low. In the year 1927, a salesman came through with a smile too wide and a suitcase full of metal toys that wound with a key. He stayed a week in a rented bed. He played the fiddle on the porch. Una listened. That week ended badly. A fever ran through the valley. People turned their faces to the wall and were gone. The salesman vanished. The cellar was dug a year later, the telling went on. Ephraim filled it with jars and bushels. Then the winter of 1929 arrived with a cruelty that cracked the animal trough and sent the creek into a rage. Ephraim went out looking for a lamb and did not return. Isabel waited until morning and then another morning. When the snow did not stop, she prayed and she baked and she told Una to take heart. The telling did not say exactly when the second person came to the farm. It never spoke the name. It never described the face. It only gave the shape of a dark jacket, the glint of a knife, the startled squeak of the kitchen chair skittering on worn pine. It gave the smell of cold iron and the bitter bark of a fox under the porch. Down in the cellar, the neat body had a ribbon still tangled in the hair. The scattered bones lost their logic the more you looked at them. Sheriff Breck's knuckles hurt from clenching. Deputy Crow made himself breathe slow, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way his grandmother had shown him when nightmares came. Calhoun Voss stepped back, turned away from the square, and threw up into the grass. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve and whispered a prayer with no words in it at all. The medical examiner did not arrive until past midnight, which was, if you trust such things, a mercy. In that interval between discovery and official presence, the four of them stood and sat and leaned at the edges of the playground and listened. And the telling kept telling. When the school district bought the land in 1961, it found the house already fallen in on itself and the cellar capped with timber and pressed clay. Men who were paid by the hour, shovel by shovel, filled it, quick to finish, quick to forget. The playground was laid out with good intentions and county paint. Children clambered and slid. Teachers drank coffee and watched a hawk ride a thermal over the cedar stand. Sometimes a child suddenly cried out for no reason anyone could see. Sometimes a little green ball rolled from under the slide with nobody there to push it. The examiner's van pulled in with a sigh of gravel. Two people climbed out, Leda March and her assistant, a quiet man named Peregrine Hollis, who wore gloves like a second skin. They moved with careful purpose, brushing, bagging, photographing, measuring. Leda had eyes that never flickered, not even when stories tried to lay their weight on her. An old trick she had learned in Charleston, where the dead crowded closer. "These bones have been here a long time," she said. She did not write a year. She did say that the longer, neater set belonged to a young woman in her late teens or just past it. The scattered set, she said softly, was peculiar. She would know more later, but her first sense was that some pieces did not belong to the same person. There were two right ulnae. There were teeth that did not match the jaw. There was a patella that looked, for all the world, like it had been carried in from elsewhere and dropped. "We will take them," she said. We will take the surrounding soil. We will call the state. The school must not reopen this area for now. Maria nodded, though school had no place in her life anymore. Though children were memories that moved through her house like sunlight across a floor, she felt something unhook in her chest when the boxes were lifted from the earth. It was not peace, exactly, but it was a loosening. The feeling you have when the house you grew up in is finally painted the color your mother wanted, the one the weather never allowed. The next day brought press vans and speculation. Hornbeam County had not had a story in years unless you count the lightning-struck heifer or the state championship in girls basketball. People wanted a ghost, which was understandable. It is easier to love a ghost you can point to than to live with a sorrow that has no edges. Sheriff Breck gave a measured statement. Deputy Crow guided traffic that did not need guidance. Calhoun took off his cap and put it on again and walked away to the cedar line where he sat on a stump and wept alone. That evening, as the sun slid down and turned the floodlit dirt square into a black mirror, Maria returned. She brought a small jar of earth from her husband's grave and a sprig of rosemary from the plant that had grown by her kitchen door since the year their son was born. She did not climb the seesaw or touch the swing. She stood at the edge of the square and spoke in a low voice, meant for the spaces under things. "I do not know your name," she said. "I do not know what you wanted, or what was taken from you, or whether the ribbon was your idea or someone else's. But you were seen last night. And tonight you are seen again. If you can rest now, rest. If you cannot, I will stand here until the clock strikes the hour of the fox, and listen once more." The wind came low and steady. The chains did not sing. A late bird crossed the sky and tucked into the cedar. Maria waited. She had become good at waiting without demanding anything in return. When the breath of the cellar rose and touched her face, it felt like stepping into a remembered room. The telling changed. It became a thanking. Not a word she heard with her ears, but one she understood the way you understand the look a stranger gives you when you lift a heavy suitcase into the overhead bin. Una, the name came, and with it the soft shaping of Isabel. Not a sound, but a press of syllables that laid themselves against Maria's bones. She saw, in the mind's corner, where things appear when you do not try to see them, a ribbon the color of late strawberries, a kitchen chair with a woven seat, a hand lifting a hatch, and another hand touching that hand and saying, in a voice that held no fear, "We are together now." Then the telling drifts were gone. In their place came only the ordinary night. The neighbor's dog barked and barked at nothing, and then gave up and lay down. Somewhere a screen door slapped. The moon took its time and climbed. Maria stood until the hour she had promised arrived, the hour that feels like a held breath before dawn. And then she laid the sprig of rosemary in the square and walked home along the ditch where glowworms stitched green stitches. In the weeks that followed, the state lab confirmed that one set of remains belonged to a young woman who likely died in the early years of the last century. The other bones proved to be a jumble gathered over time, mostly animal, with a few human fragments of uncertain provenance. The county commissioners voted to move the swing set to the far end of the lot and to plant a ring of redbud trees around the capped cellar site. The principal asked a local carpenter to build a bench with a woven seat pattern in honor of no one in particular and everyone at once. He did so in quiet maple, and it sat in the shade of the new trees, and the children ran around it with chalk on their knees. There were still stories. You cannot take stories away from a place any more than you can empty a river by cupping your hands. Some evenings, if you stood by the cedar line when the dusk was gray and kind, you could hear, or you thought you could hear, the faint rasp of a fiddle followed by the steadier sound of bread being sliced on a wooden board. Calhoun Voss stopped chewing gum, and he carried peppermints instead. Deputy Crow married a nurse from Oak Hollow and had a daughter he named Illyria because he wanted her to have a name nobody else shouted on the playground. Sheriff Breck began to drink tea after a certain hour because coffee kept his hands shaking. Leda March transferred to a quieter office and found that sometimes Her hands reached for invisible soil while she sat at a stoplight. As for Maria, she finished knitting the gray scarf she had started in spring and left it folded on the bench under the redbuds against the first cold snap. When she passed the playground at first bell on a bright Monday, she noticed the children hesitated at the edge of the ring of trees, and then in ones and twos stepped inside to sit and tell each other jokes. Their laughter bounced off the stone of the school and into the sky like lime green balloons. She did not walk that way at night anymore. Not because she was afraid, but because the listening she had promised had been completed, and it is ungenerous to listen beyond the appointed time. On the anniversary of the night the hatch was opened, she walked to the small cemetery by the creek with a paper bag of apples. She left them under the old oak, where hunger sometimes passes. She said the names the telling had given her very softly, not because anyone needed to hear, but because names are the first and last things we carry. Next story. Trapped in the haunted cave for days. An American account from the Ozark backcountry in the late autumn of 2019, the first cold front of the season slid over northern Arkansas and turned the hardwoods the color of banked embers. By the end of that week, the wind moved in long inland breaths, drawing leaves across County Road 37 and rattling the cattails in the ditch. I was driving my old slate-colored pickup toward the Boston Mountains, past farms with tin roofs and rusted propane tanks, toward a limestone ridge the locals called Sparrow's Spine. Folklore in these hills travels farther than cell service, and I had come to write about it. I was freelancing then, living from one assignment to the next, nursing a quiet hunger for stories that could hold a room the way a hymn holds a chapel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? My name is Lysander Pike. People call me Pike. I never sought out ghosts. I preferred the living. But a tip had landed in my inbox about a cave above a dry creek bed. A cave that took and kept things, a cave that talked when the wind was off the river and the hollows were still. The note had been signed only with the name Thaddeus and a cross street in Kingston where I could meet him. He never showed. He sent one last text that read, "Simply go before the hunters wake the ridge, and then silence stretched like wire. I went anyway. Pride can be a poor lantern." I parked at the trailhead just after daybreak on a Saturday, mist in the low ground and a hawk riding a bright seam of air. The signboard, riddled with 22 holes, warned about karst hazards, sinkholes, sudden drop-offs, flash flooding. A violet ribbon was tied to the post, as if someone had left a reminder for themselves and never returned. I should have been discouraged. Instead, I shouldered my pack, clipped my headlamp to the strap, and walked until the gravel turned to bare rock, and the bare rock turned to dead leaves that whispered with each step. Sparrow's Spine is a long ridge, honeycombed and hollowed by old water that has long since moved elsewhere. The entrance to the cave did not look like a mouth, so much as an eyelid half closed against the light. I had expected a tourist cave with handrails and a kiosk. What I found was a bruise in the earth, a shadow where no shadow should have lingered. The air at the threshold cooled my sweat in an instant. Beyond it, the world tightened and thinned. The first chamber was low enough that I had to bow, then crawl, and then blessedly stand. Moonbird Cave, the old men at the feed store had called it. No map, no tours, a dry system most of the year, they said, except when it was not. Bring a buddy, they advised. I did not. I had a tripod, a small recorder, a thermos of coffee, a packet of jerky, a notebook, a pen, and the confidence of a man who had been lucky too many times to believe that luck was finite. Inside, sound changed its mind about what it wanted to be. Every step made a small thunder. Every breath carried farther than it needed to. I clicked on my headlamp, then my backup light, and the walls sprang forward, racked and pitted and damp. The floor was a history of water written in ribs of limestone. A faint smell of penny metal threaded the air. I said my name out loud because I once read that if you want to stay anchored underground, you should tell the dark who you are. Lysander Pike, I said, and my voice came back in tatters. Present, I added, because that felt necessary. I moved deeper. Time lost its usual close. There were no sunbeams to cut the hours, only the steady drip from the ceiling and the patient hush of unseen chambers ahead. After what might have been an hour or only a long breath, I found a place where the ceiling rose and the room widened. A tumble of breakdown stones made a rough staircase to a second level. Off to my left, a passage narrowed into a keyhole slit. Wind stroked my cheek there, cold as a hand washed in creek water. The recorder in my pocket vibrated. Without thinking, I pulled it out and pressed record. The red dot ballooned. At first I heard nothing but my own breath and the hiss of the lamp. Then it came, as soft as lint, a voice tucked into the breeze. Not words, not yet, a cadence. A sort of syllabic reaching, as if someone were trying to speak with a mouthful of sleep. The hair along my forearms lifted. I tilted the microphone toward the slit and waited. The wind deepened. Something like a name threaded through the air. Thad, Thad, Thad. I swallowed. Thaddeus, I whispered, and the cave returned one long thaw, like a string being pulled through a ring. If this was a prank, it was exquisite and cruel. If it was geology, it was a coincidence wearing a mask. I told myself I would gather a minute of room tone and go. I told myself I would not wedge my shoulders through that aperture. I went in anyway. The keyhole shaved my jacket and grated my belt buckle. The limestone kissed my ribs. I exhaled and slid, held my breath, wriggled, then fell 2 body lengths into a sump of cold air where the floor dropped without being polite about it. I landed hard on my left side, breath gone, headlamp skidding into a wedge of stones where the beam pinned itself on a stalagmite like a pinned moth. The sound I made was small and embarrassing. I lay there, tasting copper, and let my breath find its way back to me. When I tried to stand, my ankle buckled. I sat again and cursed, then laughed, because laughter sometimes convinces pain that it is not welcome. My headlamp was still shining. My backup light was around my neck on a cord. My pack had stayed with me. My radio, which I had not charged as carefully as I should have, was clipped to the strap and blinking a sullen amber. I checked my ankle. A sprain. I could put weight on it if I made a bargain with myself about the pace. I gathered my lamp. I gathered my pride. I gathered the little recorder and listened. The cave was speaking in its sleep again, the same reaching, the same soft TH sounds, as if stone had learned how to whisper through missing teeth. I meant to reverse my route, but the fissure I had slid through had become another fissure, then another. The tight throat that had admitted me became a dozen throats wearing the same expression. I tried one, then another, then a third, and came back to the same room where my scuff marks crossed themselves like a bad signature. Heat rose under my jacket. Panic tends to oversalt the soup. I sat on my pack and drank coffee from the thermos. It had gone lukewarm, but it steadied my hands. I told the dark who I was again, not because the dark needed to know, but because I did. Lysander Pike. Present, I said, and I added, not lost yet. My voice cracked on the last word. The recorder caught it. I searched for high ground. Caves are maps that refuse to be folded the same way twice. I tried the keyhole in reverse, found a lip, found another, then found only a pinch that owned my chest and would not let go. I backed out carefully. I was not going to die in a choke if I had a choice. I needed a different route and more light than my headlamps could provide. I took stock. Jerky. A half loaf of cornbread wrapped in wax paper. 2 liters of water. The thermos. A foil blanket. A lighter. A pencil and the notebook. A slim paperback collection of ballads I had brought for company and never intended to open. My phone, now a brick. The radio, which blinked at me like a bored reptile. I turned it on and called my own name as if I were 2 people, static like dry leaves. I thought of Thaddeus and felt a private dread, the way you feel when you know a letter will not arrive because the postman no longer walks that road. Afternoon, by whatever clock lives inside the body, slid toward evening. The cave's air cooled in a way that told me there was a vast volume somewhere nearby, breathing in and out with the changes above. I gathered rocks and spelled help on a flat shelf, not because I believed a person would see it, but because the gesture put my hands to work. Then I did something I never do. I sang a song I learned from a coal miner in eastern Kentucky. My voice was unremarkable, but the cave liked it. It returned the notes one at a time and dressed them in velvet. When I finished, the wind in the keyhole passage released a word that landed clean. Gooseflesh everywhere at once. I whispered thank you without meaning to. The lamp hummed like an insect. I slept for a while with my back against the breakdown pile, the foil blanket loud in the silence. Dreams came in mineral colors. I woke unsure whether seconds or hours had passed. Hunger pressed the edges of my temper. I ate a small square of cornbread and a curl of jerky, then drank a careful mouthful of water. The second day was a braid of trial and error. I marked with pencil every stone I climbed, every ridge I slid along, left arrows on damp surfaces, and dripped coffee to stain the floor where the pencil could not find purchase. The room sprawled into rooms. The keyhole gave way to a trench. The trench stepped down into a vault, where the ceiling was night and my lamps were starlight. In the vault, something waited. Bones rested in a pocket of dust, not arranged, not scattered by predators, but set aside the way a man sets aside his hat before sleep. A tin canteen, pitted and mended with solder, a blackened pipe, a scrap of blue cloth that had once belonged to a shirt and remembered a shoulder, a name scratched in the limestone with a nail or a luckier rock. Thad. The letters were deep, the way a person carves when they do not plan to leave quickly. My throat closed. I touched the T, the H, the A, the D, and found the edges dulled by time. Wind moved and the cloth stirred. The recorder listened. I do not know what I expected to hear. A prayer, a confession, a song. What I heard was a hush, like a tired breath. Then a voice so close to my ear that I flinched and struck my shoulder against stone. Lysander, the cave, said again, almost kindly. Then, lower, a word that sounded like stay. No. I said out loud, and the word fled in a panic that felt like my own. I do not know if I was speaking to the stone or to the part of myself that began to understand how easy it would be to stay. Underground there is a mercy. There are no bills, no deadlines, no questions about whether you wasted your luck or squandered somebody else's patience. There is only yes and no, breath and no breath. I tied the blue cloth around my wrist and stood. The radio crackled once like a match. A voice arrived, faint as ash. Search and rescue, the voice said. Identify. I sat down hard. My own name felt extravagant. Lysander Pike, I said. Moonbird Cave, Sparrow's Spine, north of Kingston. Sprained ankle, diminishing light. Food for a day and a half if I am careful, water for maybe 2. I do not know the time. I am not sure how far in I am. I am not alone. The last sentence left my mouth before I could censor it. Static returned. Then, the voice. Clearer. Repeat last, the dispatcher said. Are you with a second party? I looked at the bones in the canteen and the quiet blue cloth tied to me. I closed my eyes. Negative, I said. Not a second party, just an impression. I am sorry. Copy, the voice said. Stay put if you can. We will stage at the trailhead. Do you have 2 light sources? Do not move into unmapped passage. Conserve your battery. We will call again. The radio went empty. The cave exhaled. My ankle throbbed the way an old grudge throbs. I propped my foot on my pack and breathed through the hurt. For a while, I talked to the person whose pipe had been left behind. Thaddeus, I said, and the cave tried to repeat it and failed, because caves have no tongues for the D sounds. I told him what I could see, which was my way of reminding myself what was real. I made a list of sensory facts, as if writing a grocery list to anchor the afternoon. The air was colder in the vault than in the trench. The rock wore mineral beards. The chalk line of a fossil shell curved along a ledge like a secret smile. Far away, water traveled inside the walls, steady, patient, sure. I slept again in fits, woke with my mouth full of the taste of old pennies. I dreamed of a boy lost in a wheat field, his mother calling his name until her voice wore thin. I dreamed of a mineshaft prop blowing apart, of men counting their friends when they came up and finding the count incomplete. I dreamed of the radio as a chapel bell. The third day, when hunger became a new religion and thirst took 1/10 of my patience per hour, the cave started to show me its temper. A rush of air came down the trench, as if somebody had opened a door in a big house. Pebbles skipped. A thin trickle of dust sifted from the ceiling and coated my tongue. I swallowed and tasted the past. My lamps burned old. The backup light grew jumpy as a fevered animal. I rationed both and used them in shifts, listening to my own heartbeat when the dark settled in like a large, soft animal. I thought about the first story I had ever written that mattered, about a tornado that passed over an unincorporated town at 3 in the morning and left a loaf of bread uncut on a kitchen counter where there had been no kitchen. I thought about the preacher who told me you can bless a place by speaking gently to it. I thought about a girl named Ione who once told me that there is a difference between being alone and being solitary. Alone, she said, is a bruise. Solitary is a stone warmed by your own hand. I wanted a stone I could warm. Instead, I had limestone, cold and indifferent as a ledger. The radio cracked again. The voice had changed. A woman this time, steady and brisk. Lysander Pike, this is Deputy Marigold Tiller with the Madison County Sheriff's Office. We have 2 teams on the ridge and a third at the lower hollow. We need you to speak every half minute for the next 5 minutes. Use the word lantern. We will listen for your voice and for any resonant frequencies. If you can strike metal on rock, do that as well. Lantern, I said, and the word traveled until I could hear it, returning from places I had no wish to meet yet. I struck my canteen lighter than I remembered it, against a knob of stone. The cave took the ring and tuned it like a piano wire. Lantern? I said again. Softer, so the echoes would not step on one another. Lantern? A pause. Lantern? Good, Deputy Tiller said. Again. Lantern. Copy, she said. Hold! I held. Time settled on my shoulders like an unfamiliar coat. I counted my breaths and lost track and started again. I thought of sunlight as an action verb instead of a thing. I ate the last of the cornbread and saved the last of the jerky for when the tremor in my hands became unignorable. In the vault, the air changed. The blue cloth at my wrist lifted once like a gesture of acknowledgement. Voices came next, too faint to claim at first, then braided with static. Hold your place, Mr. Pike, a man said, voice disembodied, a little hollow. We think we have you on the right flank. If you hear 3 whistles, respond with 2. I listened. The cave listened with me. Then, ghost thin, 3 shrill chirps stuttered across the vault. I brought my fingers to my lips and blew 2 whistles as best I could. They were small and apologetic. The cave gathered them up and returned something like courage. Good, the man said. Again, 2 whistles, silence. Then a boom somewhere far off that might have been a stone moving where stones ought not to move. The radio hissed. Deputy Tiller's voice crossed the hiss like a stepping stone. Mr. Pike, we have a barometric drop and radar shows a pop-up cell on the county line. If water enters the system, we will have to pull back. We are pushing 1 more team toward you. If the water finds you first, climb. Do you copy? Climb if you feel any draft change. Get as high as you can and tie yourself in if you have any cordage. We will not risk the team in a surge. Do you copy? I copied. My mouth had gone chalk dry. The word climb found very little to hold on to inside me. My ankle thrummed a hazard note. The wind came first, but not the friendly searching draft that brings you news from the entrance. This one shouldered in without apology. The cave spoke in a lower register. Pebbles danced. Dust fell. I swore out loud and pushed my pack beneath the breakdown lip. The bones in the alcove looked at me without looking. The blue cloth tugged at my wrist. I shouted up the trench and heard the trench answer. I limped toward the highest part of the vault where the walls narrowed into a chimney. The chimney was a rough throat. A man could braced climb it if he wanted to feel his shoulders grind into history. I wanted that. I shoved my back into one side and my boots into the other and made my way up like an awkward beetle. Halfway up, the water arrived. It was not a roar at first. It was a sound like a classroom of children whispering, then like prairie wind in a fence, then like a sudden 1,000 hands clapping once. When it rounded the bend below, it brought a smell that made me think of a river wrenching its way through winter. The first lick ran across my boot and chilled me straight through to my lungs. I climbed harder than I knew I could. My shoulders slid, my ankles shrieked, the chimney narrowed, and became kinder for a brief, blessed moment. I found a shelf and dragged myself onto it. The shelf was as wide as my hips and as long as a short child. I pressed my chest to the stone and shook. The water spoke louder now, the way a crowd speaks on courthouse steps. "Mr. Pike," the radio cried, thin, frantic. "If you are in the vault, climb as high as possible. Say lantern if you can. Say anything." "Lantern," I croaked and coughed. The words slid off the water and came back to me torn into syllables. I tied my belt around a knob and then around my waist. The shelf tilted in a way that told me it had been waiting for its moment for 100,000 years. I kissed it out of some ancient instinct. I do not kiss many things. This felt earned. For a while, there was only the sound of the flood teaching the cave a new song. In the calamitous music, a smaller voice found me. It was not Thaddeus. It was a woman's voice, distant and sure. "Hold, Lysander," she said, as if we were at a river crossing together. "Just hold." I held. The water climbed, then paused, then climbed again. It filled the trench and the lower room and licked the edge of the shelf, and then mercifully stopped as if it had remembered an appointment elsewhere. I learned then that gratitude can be as physical as hunger. I cried without sound, and the cave took the salt and made no remark. When the water went out, it left silt and a smell like wet stone. It left room, it left a clean shine on the bones. It left me shaking and breathing like a man who had run a race inside a straw. The radio came back in tatters. "We have to pull the lower teams," Deputy Tiller said. "We will wait for the surge to pass. If you can shelter in place, do so. We will come when we can come." I said copy, and the word was a scratch on old paper. I slept with my belt tied and my cheek pressed to limestone. I dreamed of the hawk I had seen over the road, how it rode a seam of air that was not visible but was there just the same. When I woke, the cave had gone back to its long patience. Time returned in small sips. My lamps met each other's eyes like exhausted friends. I could hold them both on low for a day if the batteries didn't lie. I ate the last of the jerky and sucked the last drops from the canteen and told myself I was not going to barter with thirst. I removed the belt and tested my ankle. It answered with fire, but it held. I spoke softly to the vault. I read from the small book of ballads until the words felt like people in the room. When I read the stanza about a woman who waited at a window for 3 winters and then married the sea, a draft lifted the page and turned it for me. I laughed, a thin thread of sound. I think I said thank you again. If anyone ever plays back the recorder, they will hear a man who has been humbled by limestone and weather and the sound of his own name coming back to him with a different temperature. The voices returned nearer than before, not from the radio, but from the doorways of the earth. I heard the careful clink of a carabiner. I heard the slow, measured exhale of someone trying to make their breath weigh less. I heard a whisper. "Mr. Pike," a man said, voice low to keep from knocking anything loose. "If you can hear me, strike your lamp twice." I did. 2 small flares on the shelf. The light met other light and made a modest marriage in the air. A helmeted face appeared below the lip of the shelf, then another. Mud painted both. The first man had a square jaw and eyes that looked like they had been awake for a very long time. "Name's Cormac," he said. "This is Ione. We've got you." I made a sound that could have been any child's first word. I scooted forward on my hip bones. The shelf complained in a voice at the edge of hearing. Cormac reached up, clipped a loop to my belt, and set his feet in a stance that said he had carried other people out of other places, and none of them had been light. Ione steadied my headlamp with one hand and set the other on my shoulder. Her touch was specific and respectful, the way a person touches a door that is not theirs. "We're going to lower you a hair to get your legs under," she said, "because people who do this work learn to narrate as a form of mercy. Then, we're going to bring you up to this higher bench and get a harness under you proper, you with us." "Yes," I said, and the word arrived intact for the first time in a long time. The movement hurt. There was no reason to pretend otherwise. The ankle spat lightning. My back argued. My elbows made a list of grievances. We moved anyway. The shelf let me go. The chimney accepted me. The bench caught me like an ant who has been waiting at the edge of a dance floor. I sat, shaking in a way that embarrassed me, and Ione buckled me into a harness that looked like a miracle built out of webbing and confidence. The route out was not the route in. That is true of so many things. We rose through the chimney, one slow foot at a time, the three of us breathing like a small choir. In the trench, the silt made our boots whisper. In the high room, our lights braided and unbraided, and the cave returned a little of our warmth. Once, at a turn, Cormac paused and cocked his head. "Hear that," he said. I heard it too. Not voices, not water. A long, familiar quiet that meant the world above was ready to accept us again. I cried again, because daylight had become something like a person I missed, and the idea of being introduced to them filled me with a relief that made me generous toward everything, even toward my own mistakes. At the last squeeze, we found the keyhole, the one that had admitted me casually and then refused to admit me again. It had changed its posture with the surge, or perhaps I had... Cormac went first with that square patience. He turned and reached for me. "Exhale," he said, calm as weather. "All the way. Let the ribcage be an accordion. You are an accordion, friend. Good. Now, slide. Good." I slid. The rock took a tax in skin and pride. I approved the commission. On the other side, the air moved with a rhythm I recognized from every porch I have ever sat on. Ione came last, bringing the end of the rope and the certainty that had kept us all from doing anything foolish. Then we were in the entry chamber, which had become a cathedral since last I saw it. The light pouring through the eyelid of an opening felt like a person's hand on my cheek. I reached for it without meaning to. Someone laughed softly in the way you laugh in churches when joy and relief forget they are supposed to be quiet. Outside, the sky had the exact blue of enamelware, the trees had kept their fire. Deputy Marigold Tiller stood by the signboard with the ribbon in the bullet holes, her radio at her shoulder and 2 cups of something steaming in her hands. When she saw me, she did not lift the cups. She did something better. She nodded once, the way people do when a story has resolved, and when I reached her, she put one of the cups in my hand without ceremony. "You had us worried, Mr. Pike," she said. 3 days is not nothing. The ridge is greedy this year." I said I was sorry, though I am not sure what I meant by that. Sorry that I went alone. Sorry that I underestimated limestone. Sorry that Thaddeus had not been the first person they let out. She saw the cloth tied around my wrist. "He's been missing since the summer of 2014, she said. "Folks have guesses. We do not say them out loud." I touched the knot. "I found his name in there," I said. "And a pipe. And a canteen." She nodded as if we were talking about rain barrels and fence posts, because acknowledgement is not the same as drama. "We will go back when the water is done being a fool," she said. "We will bring him what we can. You drink that. Then we will look at that ankle." I drank. It was not coffee. It was broth that tasted like somebody's grandmother had stood at a stove and decided I would need forgiving. Heat came back to my hands. Birds had remembered their jobs. A truck door slammed. Somebody laughed in a way that balanced how close we had all been to not laughing at all. I stood shakily and the world let me. I asked one question, though I understood already that the answer might not help. "Do you ever hear things in there?" I said. "In your radio, in your own head, names, instructions, requests." Deputy Tiller looked at the cave, then at me. "We hear what we need to hear to do our work," she said, "and we try to leave the rest where it belongs. Some places make echoes that keep a shape for a very long time. That is not a haunting. That is the land reminding itself who it has been." The wind moved along Sparrow's spine and made a sound like a long breath through teeth. Somewhere high up a hawk held the sky in its hands. I untied the cloth from my wrist and gave it to Marigold Tiller. She tucked it into her pocket as if it were a note from a child. Cormac and Ione loaded me into the back of a county truck that smelled like rope and leather and coffee. As we rattled down the road, past the cattails, past the farms with their tin roofs and the rusted propane tanks, past a mailbox painted with sunflowers, I watched the ridge recede in the side mirror. It looked like a sleeping animal. It looked like a hymn unwritten. It looked like a mouth closed at last. In the days that followed, I listened to the recorder. I expected a chorus of strangenesses. I found only the things I had said, and the things the rescue team had said, and the music of water rehearsing its argument. But there was one place early on where the air sounded almost like a voice trying on a name. Whether it was the cave or my fear does not bear deciding, the living need their myths and the land needs its privacy. My ankle healed with a limp that grew smaller until it joined the list of aches a body accepts. I sent the story to my editor and he sent me a note that said, "Only this one feels true." I wrote back and told him that truth sometimes wears someone else's coat for a while and that I was trying to be patient with how slowly it takes the coat off. In late winter, when the maples were making small red fists, Deputy Tiller called me from the county line. They had gone back in. They found the pipe and the canteen and the letters on the wall. They found what they could, and the family had a place to stand and say a man's name into the air. She did not say the word closure. She did not need to. Some endings arrived, like doors shutting softly in a house you once lived in. I drove back to Sparrow's Spine with flowers that would not mind the cold, and left them at the entrance where the light keeps its promises. I spoke a blessing in a voice that still remembered how to be small. Then I turned away and walked the road back to my truck, each step louder in the open air, each breath a little less borrowed, the ridge behind me humming the last line of a song the way hills do when they decide a story has earned its quiet. Next stories. The night a missing boy was found alive in the Ashburn houses. They still call it the longest night Marrow Creek ever lived through. The town sits in a fold of Pennsylvania hills where the wind carries the river's smell and the soot of old rail lines. On a Wednesday in late October in the year 2014, the sky went the color of pewter by 3 in the afternoon, and the wind combed the sycamores until their pale leaves rattled like small bones. By dusk, a siren wailed from the volunteer fire hall, one long cry, and the search began. The boy's name was Orrin Hale. He was 9. He had a cowlick, like a whitecap, and a habit of counting his steps when he was nervous. He had been walking home from the after-school art club held in the church basement, carrying a shoebox diorama of a lighthouse. He never arrived. His mother, Maeve Hale, called the sheriff at 6:40, her voice small but steady. By 7, the first flashlight beams were sweeping the ditches and hedgerows along Rivermill Road. By 8, the state police had set out flares, and orange vests moved like cautious sparks across the fields. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Whispers rose the way steam rises from a pot. People spoke of the Ashburn house. Everyone knew that crumbling mansion at the far end of Wicket Lane, 2 stories of black windows and a roofline like broken teeth. It had stood empty since the late 1980s after a winter fire and a court fight over the estate. Teenagers dared each other to run up the porch steps and touch the door, then sprint back, laughing too loudly. Hunters said foxes denned beneath the porch. Older folks said other things, murmured things, about the sound of a piano in the night when no one lived there, about a smell of coal smoke after rain, about a single lamp seen in an attic window long after the power was cut. Deputy Lyle Pritchard had a map spread on the hood of his cruiser. He was a quiet man with a rain-creased face and the habit of pinching his lower lip when he was thinking. By 9, the map was speckled with the tiny thumbtack lights of cell phones, the search grids had been drawn, everyone was expected to check sheds, culverts, hedges, and the thickets by the old quarry. The deputy had to decide whether to include the Ashburn house in the sweep. He did not like superstition. He liked hinges that worked and doors that opened and shut. He liked facts. Orrin had last been seen a mile from Wicket Lane. The house was within the radius. It would be checked. At 9:30, the first team went up Wicket Lane. The lane itself was a sullen ribbon full of potholes that held old leaves and cold water. The wind made a low sound in the maples, a long hush, as if someone were shushing a crowd that did not want to be silent. The house appeared all at once, as if the trees had been hiding it. The porch sagged. The widow's walk was missing 3 balusters. A strand of police tape from some forgotten training exercise flicked in the wind and made a dry sound like the turning of a page. Calliope Vance, a reporter from the county paper, arrived just before 10. She wore boots that had seen election nights, barn fires, and county fairs. She kept a notebook in her pocket with half the pages dog-eared. She had a way of standing still in noise, as if she could hear the quiet thing inside the loud thing. She saw Maeve Hale arrive, coat thrown over pajamas, hair pulled into a knot so tight it made the lines on her forehead shine. She saw the way the crowd parted for Maeve, and the way Maeve kept looking down as if her eyes could comb the ground for her child. Calliope crossed herself without thinking. She was not especially devout, but the night made her do it. Just after 10:15, they broke the lock on the Ashburn house. The padlock had a patina of years on it, a skin of rust the color of dried blood, and the shank sheared with a crack that sounded much louder than it should have. The door swung inward, slow and complaining, and a smell came out that made even the boldest man take a step back. It was the smell of wet wood and old varnish and something faintly sweet, like wilted flowers in a closed room. There is a moment in any search when bravado drains and procedure steps forward. Pritchard raised a hand. 2 officers and 2 volunteers moved in with lamps. Held low, the lamps made circles on the floorboards where dust had gathered like light snow. Their footsteps were careful. Someone called out, another answered. The house answered too, with all the small night noises that old wood makes when light and air enter after long absence. The foyer showed a staircase that turned, then turned again, and disappeared into darkness. On the right was a parlor with a massive cold fireplace and high formal windows. On the left, double doors to a room that had once been a music room. A harp stool stood on 3 legs, its 4th broken, and the stool leaned the way a listening person leans. The wallpaper had a pattern of silver leaves that the light could not help chasing. They cleared the first floor. They found a nest of raccoon tracks and the shed skin of a snake curled behind a radiator like a forgotten ribbon. They found graffiti under the stairs in a schoolgirl hand that said simply, mercy. They found nothing else. Pritchard turned his lamp up the stairs. They would go higher. Time hooks itself to small things. 10:30 felt like a held breath. 10:33 felt like a door unlocked in the chest. 10:35 felt like every nerve was an eye. At 10:37, a sound came down from above. It was not the theatrical bang of a shutter in wind. It was not the complaint of a loose board. It was the soft, careful sound of something set down. Light swept the landing. Dust rose in a body. Then, as if the house itself had been practicing the word, a voice, here. The word was small, not more than a thread of sound in a room woven of echoes. But it was a word, and it was human, and it was near. Pritchard's lamp found the 2nd floor hall. Doors, shadows, a picture frame that held only a ghost of sun-bleached cardboard. He said the boy's name the way you say a prayer, Orrin. Silence answered, then the brave ghost of a second here. They found him in a back bedroom beneath an eave that slanted low like a conspirator. He sat on the floor, back against the bed frame, diorama box clutched to his chest. He was pale under the dust. His shoelaces were double knotted in a way that said his mother taught him good habits and he had tried to keep them. His lips were blue at the edges from the cold. His eyes were clear. He looked like a boy who had been quiet for a long time. The first word he said when Pritchard knelt was please, and the second was careful, and the third was light. They thought at first that he meant the lamp, and they turned it away. He shook his head. He looked past them, to the open door, to the dark hall beyond. He whispered, not afraid, not even excited, just very certain. It does not like bright light. They wrapped him in a quilt someone brought from the trunk of a car, one of those old pieced quilts whose seams hold the patience of 2 generations. They gave him water in a cup with a chipped lip. He drank without spilling. When Maeve reached the room, she made no sound at all. She knelt. She put her hands on either side of his face. The sound she made then was the sound people make when a weight that was going to kill them is lifted at the last second. Downstairs, someone cried into a sleeve. Outside, the town, which had been holding its breath, exhaled. They carried Orrin out past the harp stool and the radiant stove sign fallen from the pantry wall, past the front door and the glistening wet leaves and the police tape that had been retied. The wind met them and made everyone blink. Flashbulbs popped from phones. Calliope did not raise hers. She wrote what she felt in one thin line on her notepad. Found alive. 10:42. In the Ashburn house. They took him to the ambulance. The medic's hands were brisk, and his voice was the kind of gentle that has been practiced until it is as sturdy as oak. He looked at pupils, at fingernails, at the pink return to the nail beds. He checked the pulse and wrote the number with a pen that would not work, and then did the thing medics do, shook the pen with sharp little snaps until the ink had no choice but to behave. Oren watched the pen as if it were a small animal. People wanted to talk. That is what people want when fear drains and the body remembers that it is still warm. They wanted to say, I knew it would be all right, even if they had not known. Or, I always said that house wasn't as bad as folks made it, even if they had crossed the street to avoid it for years. Calliope stood aside, listening. Maeve sat in the ambulance door with one foot on the bumper. Oren rested, the quilt around his shoulders like a cape that had done its duty. At 11, the deputy came to ask careful questions. Where had he been? How had he gotten there? What did he remember? Oren's answers came in that strange calm that sometimes happens after a long fright, a calm that is not pretend, not bravado, not shock, but a child's plain report. He had left the church basement and walked past the candy store where the window held chocolate turkeys arrayed like a small army. He had crossed Rivermill Road. He had gone by the chain link fence with the sun-faded no trespassing sign. The wind had gotten very loud, and he thought he heard a note inside it, the way you sometimes hear the hum of a refrigerator when the room tries to be quiet. He had looked up and seen a light in the distance where there should not be any. He knew the Ashburn house from whispers, but the light had not been in the front. It had winked in a high window toward the back, like an eye that forgot to close. He did not remember choosing to turn. He only remembered the sense of being looked at, not meanly, not hungrily, but with the attention of a hand reaching to catch a falling cup. He had gone up Wicket Lane. The porch had creaked under his feet, and the door, which people said was always locked, had been unlatched. He had stepped inside and said hello the way you do when you walk into a home that is not yours. And then he had told Pritchard it had felt like someone put a shawl over the house. The wind stopped. The little ticks and murmurs of old wood became a whisper that moved along the walls. He did not feel afraid. He felt instructed, as if some arrangement had been made, and he had arrived right on time. He had walked to the back bedroom, he had sat down, he had put the diorama on his knees, he had waited. Pritchard wrote this down. He wrote it down even though he did not understand it. He wrote it down because understanding is not required of a report, only truth, and the boy's voice had the honest burr of truth. Maeve asked if anyone had been there with him. Oren considered. No people, he said finally. He looked at the window as if it contained a second, clear world laid over the first. But I think the house was not empty. The deputy glanced at the reporter. Calliope's pen paused. A fragment of wind lifted the edge of her page. She looked at the house. Its windows accepted the night like old eyes accept tears. People stayed even after the medic said everyone should go home. The human need to stand near a place where something has ended well is strong. It warms us like a stove. A pastor led a low prayer near the porch. Teenagers who had crossed the tape made up a story they would agree to tell their friends, leaving out their own trembling hands. Someone fetched cocoa in cardboard cups with lids that sipped poorly and left a mark on the upper lip like a child's milk mustache. In the dark, the sycamores moved their long white limbs like a slow-motion semaphore that only the river could read. Just after midnight, the first snowflake came. It was early for snow, but late for luck, and people felt the difference. The flake passed through the beam of a flashlight and dissolved against a jacket sleeve, and memories shifted, the way memories do, to make room for a better story. Before one, the crowd thinned. The ambulances had left. The tape had been pulled tight again and tied in a square knot that would hold. Maeve took her boy home, the quilt around both of them, so that for a moment they looked like a single figure, one life stitched to another. Pritchard stood alone in the lane, his cruiser idling, the map still on the hood, the thumbtack lights now only the cold ornaments of his own thoughts. Calliope did not leave. She stood on the shoulder with her notebook in her pocket, and her hands in her coat, and her breath making brief ghosts. She watched the house until watching turned into a kind of listening. That was when she heard it. Not a piano, despite the old stories. Not a voice either, not exactly. It was the frictionless sound of something being put right. A hinge seating in a jam. A loose board settling. A thread pulled through the last eye of a needle and tied off neatly. A house exhaling. The sensation moved through her like a line of warm tea. When she got back to the paper, near 2 in the morning, she wrote. She knew exactly how the first paragraph would read, and how the last would settle, and how to keep the space between them honest. She wrote in present tense because for the town, the night would always be happening, always arriving at its mercy. And when she came to the part about the light in the attic window, she paused. She did not embellish it. She did not deny it. She wrote the light as a fact in the boy's account and left it there, like a candle on a sill, enough to walk by. In the days that followed, Marrow Creek did what towns do. They brought casseroles to the Hale house and left them with notes in big pen handwriting. They pinned a thank you banner to the fence at the fire hall. Little kids drew chalk lighthouses on the sidewalk. A local carpenter named Eban Dorsey went to the Ashburn house with a toolbox and a thermos and replaced the missing balusters on the Widow's Walk because it upset him to see a railing unready to keep a person safe. He did it without permission and with such competent love that even the town clerk, who worried about liability, could only shake her head and bring him coffee. One morning, a week later, Maeve brought the shoebox diorama to the school. It had survived intact. The lighthouse was made of a paper towel tube and painted in red and white bands with a fine hand. Orrin had cut small windows and lined them in black marker. The light at the top was a foil-wrapped marble that threw a tiny cold gleam if you tilted the box near a window. He spoke to his class without drama. He said, "I thought of the light the whole time, and when I was afraid of the dark, I looked at the lighthouse and tried to be the person who kept the lamp trimmed and shining." That night, Pritchard went back to the house alone. He parked at the foot of the lane and walked up with a lamp, not because he believed the boy's words the way a child believes a spell, but because he had taken them into himself and found no harm in honoring them. He stood on the porch for a long time, the wind stuttering over the roof, the late leaves scuttering across the boards. He did not cross the threshold. He did not need to. On the way back to the cruiser, he met Eban the carpenter, coming up with a sack that chinked with new screws. Eban nodded once, like men do when they have not agreed to talk, then could not help themselves and talked anyway. "I was thinking about that word the boy used," Eban said. "Instructed. The way he said it, like the house had told him to sit and wait there, like it knew where he would be safe." Pritchard was a practical man, but practicality is not the enemy of wonder, and he felt a small involuntary warmth at the idea that some places are capable of kindness. He drove home under a sky cold and blank as a clean sheet of paper. Winter came settled and white. The river wore its thin steel skin. The children of the town learned to say Ashburn House without wanting to run away, and to look up when they said it, as if a high window somewhere might be listening. When the year turned and then turned again, the story settled into the town the way stitches settle in a scar. Not ugly, not beautiful either, simply part of the body. Years later, in early spring, when a thaw made the gutters talk and the roads show their winter wounds, Calliope received a padded envelope at the paper with no return address. Inside was a small, neat metal tag polished to a shy shine. On one side, engraved letters, Ashburn. On the other, a number that might once have matched a key on a box or a door. It was warm from someone's hand. It carried the faint scent of old wood and machine oil. She set the tag on her desk and considered writing a follow-up. She imagined the questions she would ask and the pictures she would take. Then she did something else. She walked the tag across town to the new little museum that had opened in the old rail office and placed it in a glass case beside a folded page of the paper from that October night. She typed a small card that read, "Only tag found after the recovery of Orrin Hale, Marrow Creek, year 2014. Donor prefers to be unnamed." The curator, a precise woman named Ione Willett, who categorized everything with tender avidity, tried to ask who had sent it and why. Calliope smiled. "Some stories," she said, "end better when they end." On a Sunday evening, not long after, just at the seam between day and night when the sky has a thin silver bruise to it, Maeve sat with Orrin at the kitchen table. The boy, grown taller and quieter, was working a puzzle of the coast of Maine, fitting rocky bays together with the soft tamp of knuckles. The radio gave the soft clatter of a baseball game far away. Steam rose from a mug. Maeve looked at her son's hands, which were becoming a man's hands, and she felt again the weight leave her chest as it had that night. She did not push the memory away. She let it sit with them at the table. "You remember the quilt?" she asked. He smiled. It had been washed and mended. It had a new binding now, a bright blue that made the old reds and browns sing. "It is at the foot of my bed," he said. "It keeps corners." He put the main coast in order and placed the final piece. He pressed it in, firm, and the faint click pleased them both. Outside, a breeze lifted and went on. The house gave a small, approving sound, the kind houses give when the people inside them are safe and the doors are latched, and the night can come as it always comes, with patience and with mercy, and find everyone exactly where they should be. Next stories. Stranger's Diary reveals unsolved murder's gruesome secret. The wind over Pine Hollow, West Virginia, crossed the hills like a slow breath, rattling the last oak leaves and carrying the thin smell of coal dust across the forked roads. On the 3rd of October, 1996, at 9:17 in the evening, a man named Lucan Merritt pulled into the gravel lot behind the Pine Hollow Public Library with his headlights off. He had driven through 3 counties without a radio station that would hold the night stitched together by static and the ticking of a dashboard clock that ran 2 minutes slow. In the passenger seat lay a canvas satchel he had found wedged under the back pew of a roadside church. Inside the satchel was a diary bound in cracked green leather. On the first page, written in a hand that tipped forward as if hurrying downhill, was a single sentence. "If you are reading this, then I failed to leave." Lucan was, by nature, a finder of misplaced things. He had been a surveyor's assistant until the company folded in a late autumn layoff, then a substitute teacher until the principal went with someone one town over. He kept his hair too long, his voice too soft, and his hopes buried like bulbs in winter soil. He brought the satchel inside because the library was the one place in Pine Hollow where you could hold a mystery and not be asked to pay for it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? The building was a converted depot with high windows and iron hooks where lanterns had once hung. 2 lamps burned on the reference desk, casting a syrupy light on the card catalog that no one used anymore, but no one had the heart to remove. At the back table sat Etta Quinn, the librarian, who drank peppermint tea year-round and kept an old county map pinned behind her desk. Etta had lived enough life to have been called girl, then miss, then ma'am. She raised an eyebrow when she saw the satchel and the way Lucan held it like a sleeping child. "Another lost thing," she said, voice dry and kind. "The night likes you, Lucan." "It is mutual," he said, half a smile, which was a lot for him. He told her about the little church outside Raynell, a place with whitewashed siding and a steeple that leaned as if listening. He had stopped because he saw shoes in the grass, a pair of men's boots pointing nowhere in particular. The door had not been locked. The pews smelled like pine cleaner. The satchel was under the last bench. No one had been there, though the air still held the warmth of another body. He set the diary on the table, and when the leather grazed the wood, it made a sound like a whisper. Etta brought over a magnifier that had belonged to a railman. She peered through it, her silver hair haloed by the desk lamp. The name on the second page, in the same forward-leaning hand, was given as Corbin Pike. "I am writing for the ones who will not be asked," began Corbin Pike, "and for the ones who will be asked so late, the asking becomes a cruelty. I am writing for a girl whose laughter was a small bell, who went missing on a rainy Tuesday in May, the year I turned 19. I was the last one who saw her go into the Black Oak Valley. I told the sheriff I did not. I let that lie sit so long it rooted. If you are reading this, I do not know if I will find the courage to tell the truth with my living mouth." A book is a poor mouth, forgive me. Etta glanced up. The name hit like a dropped plate. The county had a long memory, and some names were stored in a high cabinet rarely reached for. Yet Corbin Pike was one of those old sounds. There had been a poster once, curling on the bulletin board between the feed store and the diner. Missing, it had read, and below that, the black and white school picture of a girl with a braided crown and a freckle on her lip. Her given name had been Ruth Ellen Farn. She vanished in the second week of May, 1979, when the rhododendron was first thinking of bloom. The newspaper had called it Unsolved. The town called it what it was, a wound. Etta shut off one of the lamps so the light would slow. She poured more tea for both of them. Lucan turned the page. The entries were precise and haunted. Corbin described the valley behind the Pike family's blue farmhouse, a place where ground fog gathered every evening as if returning to a promised appointment. He wrote of Ruth Ellen's habit of walking the ridge at dusk, a book under her arm, reading as she walked, sometimes out loud, as if the ridge itself would forget language without her. He described the last time he saw her, the sky cooled to that silvery wash that comes before full dark, a train horn a long ridge away, a storm pressing up from the south with a steady drum of distant thunder. She was wearing a red windbreaker, he wrote, and boots scuffed along the toes from kicking stones. The entry stopped and started, as if Corbin kept putting the pen down and picking it back up, pacing between sentences. Then the words thickened. She looked at me the way people look at a map they do not trust. She asked if I would walk her as far as the Split Rock. It was the 3rd of May, 1979. It was 10 minutes past 8 by my father's Hamilton watch. There was no moon yet. There was a rope hanging from the cedar near the Split Rock where my cousins used to swing. She said she would be fine. She said she wanted to think about a poem where the river speaks. I watched her go. It would have cost me 6 minutes to follow. I did not. I do not know who I was being loyal to. The storm reached us by 10, and it rained like it meant to wipe the slate. By morning, she was gone. Lucan and Etta read on, voices low and careful, the way you handle a story that has cut people. Corbin wrote about the search parties, how they combed the hollows with lanterns and called her name until the night felt crowded with versions of her. He wrote the sheriff's questions, the way the man had narrowed his eyes as if the truth were something you could see by making your eyes smaller. He wrote about the rumor that Ruth Ellen had left by choice. With who, Corbin asked the page, and to where and why did the final equation always subtract who she really was? There was a small smear near the bottom of the page, as if a tear had not been caught in time. Then the entries snapped into a different key. Corbin began to write about the quarry. There was a quarry past the ridge, a terraced wound in the hillside. The quarry foreman was a man named Thaddeus Holt, who owned a truck with a broken taillight on the left and a way of looking at people that felt like being weighed. The Holt family went back to lumber times. They had money and land, and they moved as if the earth were theirs like a keyring. Thaddeus was in his late 30s that spring, with a face that would not commit to kind or cruel. He stood near the counter at the diner on the morning of the 5th and told Deputy Moxley that the quarry night watch had seen nothing. I did not believe him in the way a dog does not believe the hand that twice denies. I did not have proof. I had something worse, a small fear that I had done so little and it would turn into a lifelong habit. The diary moved forward in steps. Corbin wrote that he tried to speak to Ruth Ellen's mother and could not. He walked up the Pike driveway to the cedar and stared at the rope swing until he got dizzy with the rounds it must have turned. He wrote down times like someone trying to build a ladder of moments back to the one that broke. He wrote about working at a repair shop in Blue Lick, about washing carburetors in a thin, sour smell, about going home with his hands raw and his mind worse. He mentioned a pocket watch with a loose hinge, the Hamilton that had kept time the night Ruth Ellen disappeared. He said he kept it in a drawer because he did not deserve to know the hour. Etta tapped the page. The Hamilton, she said, barely above a whisper. Her eyes moved to the wall where the county map hung with its stunned constellations of pins. Lucan nodded. There were so many Hamiltons in the mining towns that the brand was nearly a local species, but the diary's insistence on the watch felt like a thread to pull later. He turned another page. The entry was dated late October of the same year. Corbin wrote about the storm that had come on a Friday, the creek flooding past the culverts, the quarry road sluiced with mud. He had taken a shortcut that evening across Holt property, he wrote, because his mother had a fever and he needed to fetch the doctor. He had seen the Holt truck near the quarry service gate. The left taillight was out. The right glowed like a single red eye. I tell myself now that I should have looked into the bed of that truck, he wrote, but the rain was a curtain and the doctor was half a mile behind and I was 19 and cowardice was wearing a believable costume. I kept moving. The diary thinned after that, as if the writer had lost the habit of confession. Months went by with only fragments. I saw her bracelet in a dream and woke with the taste of metal, he wrote in late winter. Then another spring came, and he wrote the name Ruth Ellen 3 times in a row and underlined it. Then the entries stopped. Lucan leaned back, eyes burning from the small type. He could feel a tug in the writing, a bias towards self-punishment, yet he could also feel something else. Corbin had set off signals in the diary and then never followed them. The quarry, the taillight, the rope swing, the Hamilton watch that had become an instrument of guilt. All signs, none of them tied to proof. Etta set the magnifier down and folded her hands. Her peppermint tea rose in a faint wreath. She spoke in the soft tone that carries in a library better than any shout. He did not know how to finish, she said. People who do not know how to finish often leave a tool. Lucan waited. The tool is the diary, she added, and then she glanced again at the wall map, eyes pausing over a pale blue vein labeled Holt Quarry Road. The quarry had closed more than a decade after Ruth Ellen vanished, and Holt money had gone into real estate and then into nothing anyone could see. There was a bell over the library door that barely rang for regulars and clanged for strangers. At 10 after 10, it clanged. A man in a canvas coat and a cap pulled low came in and stood just inside, letting the bell sound finish, which took a long time because something about him made time expand in the room. He took off the cap and revealed a forehead cut in a straight pale line where a hard hat might have sat for years. He had the posture of someone who had listened to machines more than to people. He looked like a rock that had decided to try speaking. "Evening," he said, rough as gravel. Etta's voice was librarian courteous. "We are closing in 20 minutes, she said. "Can we help you in that span?" "I am not here to borrow," the man said. "I am here to return." He lifted a small leather wallet from his coat, and from the wallet a folded paper. He laid it on the reference desk. Etta opened the paper and saw the first page of a photocopy from a county case file. The missing person report of Ruth Ellen Farn, filed by her mother at 9:20 in the morning the day after she vanished. The nameless man pointed to the bottom of the page. "It says here the last person to see her alive was listed as unknown," he said. "I know who it was." Lucan felt the air in the room tilt. Etta did not look at the man immediately. She looked at the diary, then at Lucan, then only at last at the man, as if to acknowledge that her days were not, after all, a loop that ended where they began. "And who might you be?" she asked. The man tapped his chest. His fingernails were squared and clean. "Name's Osric Vale," he said. "I ran night watch at Holt Quarry for 20 and more years. I checked the trucks in and out, and I saw on that Tuesday night in May of that old year a girl in a red jacket stand outside the service gate with a book in her hand and her braid gone loose. I saw the foreman, Thaddeus Holt, offer her a ride down the hill because the rain had started. She said yes. She got into the truck. That was the last time she stood on both feet on Holt land." Etta's hand went to her throat and stopped there. Lucan could hear the clock on the wall for the first time since the man entered. The ticking had the accent of a metronome. Osric Vale blinked slowly and added a final sentence that sounded like he had carried it for longer than it deserved to be carried. "I should have called the sheriff right then," he said. "But a man likes to keep a job. A job is bread. I kept it until it was gone, and then the story remained and the bread did not." They let the clock tick for a count of 30. Then Etta spoke again, slow, as if her words were numbered and she did not intend to use more than necessary. "We need more than a confession," she said. "We need a direction. We need a place in the earth to go to. Do you have one of those, Mr. Vale?" Osric Vale nodded once. "I do," he said. "The quarry flooded in the late 80s when they stopped pumping. There are terraces, and there is a pit, and there is a shelf at the west lip that holds a rusted bobcat and some chain in a pile of timbers. There is a hollow under the shelf where the limestone caved. There is also, I believe, a girl's jacket. I have not said this to anyone. I am saying it now because I had a dream last week of a bracelet found in clay. It was a dream like a fact. It woke me. Etta looked at Lucan with a question and a permission. Lucan nodded. He could feel the strange alignment of small choices that moves an ordinary life into the mouth of a larger story. He slid the diary into its satchel and handed it to Etta for safekeeping. Then he and Osric walked out into the night. They drove in Lucan's truck, Osric pointing with his cap held in a fist, the way old men point when their bodies have become compasses. The quarry road had been blocked by a rusting gate for years, but Osric knew where the padlock had lost its innards to winter and could be persuaded by a careful twist. They parked under a hemlock full of wind and walked. The flooded pit opened before them like a blind eye. The water held the moon in a shiver. Osric halted and lifted his hand. "Listen," he said, as if the earth keeps the pitch of a memory. The quarry did have a sound, a long dim hum made by the wind, playing the terraces like a mouth on a bottle. They skirted the west lip. There was the bobcat, starved of paint, and the chain, a line of orange beads. Osric knelt near the shelf and touched the ground. He had the reverence of someone greeting a longed-for face. "But here," he said, "right here is where the shelf cracked when they drove the Holt truck too close. I set timbers as a stop. I remember that jacket like a fox at the edge of the woods. I remember the foreman saying he found it in the cedar thicket and that the girl must have run. I remember him laughing at his own lie." Lucan crouched and peered into the hollow. The mud had slumped toward the center, exposing streaks of pale stone. He felt for a long branch and used it to worry the mud aside. He did not know what he expected to see. He did not expect red. But there it was, a smear that might have been paint if you did not know better, the color softened by years underwater and then air. He jabbed carefully at the mud and then stopped because something metallic flashed. He put down the branch and made a small sound in his throat. Osric climbed down beside him with the old caution of a man who had worked among weights that kill. He put his fingers into the mud, as if the mud were tender, and drew out a thin silver band circled with a charm in the shape of an oak leaf. He held it flat on his palm. It was beautiful in that way. Small things are when they are all that remain. They wrapped the bracelet in Lucan's handkerchief. They took photographs with Lucan's flip phone, the only piece of technology that behaved for him. The photographs would be poor, but proof does not always require quality. They stood and looked at each other, the water behind them breathing. Osric said he could take Lucan to a place on the service road where tire ruts still made sense if you knew how to read old ground. Lucan nodded. Then the world took a sideways step. A pair of headlights slid up the far side of the pit, too bright and too slow, as if the driver were taking the measure of things before committing. The truck rolled to a stop. The lights went off. A door opened. The sound walked across the quarry. Lucan's throat turned to grit. Osric straightened, his breath suddenly formal. The man who climbed down the slope toward them carried a lantern in one hand and a shovel in the other. Thaddeus Holt had grown older, but some faces settle and some curdle. His had taken the second path. He had put on an expensive coat over a body that no longer woke to labor. His hair had thinned to a combed conclusion. He saw them and he smiled, and the smile did not touch his eyes. "Well, now," he said, "we have students in night lessons." He lifted the lantern, and Lucan could see the man's knuckles, the way power had polished them. "Mr. Vale, I wondered where the old ghost kept his keys." Then his gaze slid to Lucan. "And who are you?" Lucan answered with his name. He did not add anything about the library or the habit of finding lost things. He did not give the man something to take. Thaddeus Holt's eyes flicked to the bracelet in Osric's handkerchief. He took a slow step forward, and the lantern light made a circle that cut the ground into those who belonged and those who were intruding. Osric took a step back and set his jaw to a degree it had not reached in years. "We found something that does not belong to you," Osric said. Thaddeus nodded. "Nothing on this old rock belongs to anyone anymore," he said. "And yet men still try to claim. Put it down and leave my land, gentlemen. It is late. There have been accidents here. Lucan felt a tremor run the length of the night. He had been quiet his whole life, and quiet had served him except when it had not. He was holding the diary back at the library in his mind, as if its weight could steady his hand here. He thought of the line about a book being a poor mouth. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Holt," he said, at a volume that would travel and settle. "The sheriff will be here soon. We will be bringing him. He will see the hollow under the shelf, and he will see the bracelet, and he will see the photographs and the tire ruts. He will ask where you were on the 3rd of May, 1979, at 10 in the evening. He will ask if you gave a girl a ride. He will ask why your left taillight was out." Thaddeus watched Lucan speak as if he were watching a performance put on for someone else. When Lucan reached the part about the taillight, something in Thaddeus's face changed in the slightest manner, and the change was worth a chapter. Osric saw it too. He lifted his chin. "You picked her up," Osric said. "You took her to the shelter under the shelf when the rain turned mean. You tried to touch what was not yours to touch," she argued. "You pushed, the shelf cracked. You frightened yourself. You said to me the next morning that gravel shifts, that nothing is certain, that the girl probably ran off to Charleston with some long-haired boy. I carried your lie like a school bag till my shoulders ached. I am done." Thaddeus lifted the shovel and laid it across his shoulder like a piper lays a flute. His voice came back with new iron. "There is no body," he said. "There is no crime without a body. You have told yourselves a story, and you have told it with feeling. The county likes feeling. Feeling keeps folks from asking why jobs go, why the houses tilt, why their kids leave. Feeling is cheaper than roads. What you have is a trinket found in mud and a bedtime tale. Go home." Osric took a step forward then, which cost him. He had moved warily for so long that sudden movements had nearly been erased from his catalog. He stepped forward anyway and lifted the handkerchief with the bracelet as if showing an altarpiece. "This is a girl's life," he said. "Her mother kept a plate at the table for a year after she vanished. Her brother would not go near creeks. Her teacher quit teaching poetry. Her name was Ruth Ellen. We are not going home." The lantern flame guttered and returned. The quarry hummed. Lucan understood suddenly that Thaddeus Holt had not come here to be surprised by them. He had come to check a place that had itched him for decades. He had returned to the scene the way men return to mirrors. Meeting them here turned his check into a confrontation. He shifted the shovel from his shoulder to his hands. He lifted the blade a few inches. "You have been on my property 10 minutes, he said. "You have told me a story I do not care for. I am telling you to leave. Now." Lucan had nothing but words and a phone and a diary in a library that was 2 miles away. He thought of the cedar rope, of Corbin Pike counting minutes. He thought of his own long practice of stepping aside. He thought of the simple, unforgiving verb to stand. They did not move. It was Osric who reached into his pocket and did something he had not done in years. He held up a badge. It was old, the enamel scuffed, the county seal dulled, but the authority on it was not wholly gone. He had been deputized in the early 2000s to help with a flood evacuation up near Talcott, and he had never returned the badge because no one asked, and because people born under mines keep their badges the way they keep old nails. He held it at chest height. "I am calling the sheriff," he said, "and I am reporting that you have interfered with the discovery of possible human remains." He slipped the badge back into his pocket, took out his phone, and began to speak into it with the cadence of a man reciting from a sheet that exists only in his mind. Thaddeus Holt watched him, and the shape of the night changed again. The foreman of the past made a calculation in the present. He did not swing the shovel. He did not run. He did something more revealing. He set the shovel down, put his hands in his pockets as if to indicate an absence of intent, and he smiled without teeth. "You bring the law," he said. "I will bring my lawyer." He climbed back up to his truck, and the lantern made song with the chain as he passed. He drove away without headlights until the curve, then lit them when the road turned toward the old world where the law has buildings. The quarry returned to its hum. Osric ended his call and exhaled in a way that left him smaller. By the time the sheriff arrived, which was near midnight, the moon had climbed and the pit looked like a coin missing value. Sheriff Adela Moxley, daughter of the deputy in the diary, stepped down from her cruiser with two deputies behind her. She had a long stride and a look that let you know the truth would eventually be told. Lucan showed her the bracelet, the photographs, the hollow under the shelf. Osric told her about the truck and the taillight and the red jacket and the long withholding. Lucan said the name Corbin Pike and handed over the satchel with the diary, which Etta had insisted on bringing herself. The library bell had clanged one last time for the night, and Etta had locked up and driven peppermint steam still in her thermos, because she would not allow that diary to leave the county without a witness. Sheriff Moxley opened the diary with the care of someone who had known its shadow since childhood. She read the first page and she closed her eyes once, which was all she allowed herself. She called for a search team with a forensic consultant from Beckley. The consultant arrived near 2 in the morning with a cooler of tools and a way of speaking to mud. They worked under floodlights that made the quarry feel like a stage set built for a very slow play. At 4, a deputy held up a small button with a flower pressed into it. At 5, another found a string of sewing thread preserved in clay. The bracelet lay on a clean cloth like a star. When the sun finally took the place in the sky it liked best, a piece of bone was lifted in a small sieve. The consultant looked up and nodded. Everyone who had been awake all night felt a second-day break inside the first. Sheriff Moxley placed Thaddeus Holt under arrest for obstruction that morning, and by evening for suspicion of homicide based on material evidence pending full identification. He was taken from his large house on Birch Street while people watched from porches with their morning coffee not yet cold and their mouths a little open. The old Holt money bought an attorney whose voice had unwrapped many men from many ropes. The attorney said there was no direct evidence. The attorney said the bracelet could have been dropped any time. The attorney said the ground shifts and stories shift and memory is unreliable. The attorney said the word conjecture with relish. For once, the county had more than memory. It had the diary, and it had Osric Vale, and it had a button, and a thread, and a thin band of silver in a place in the earth where a shelf had given way. It had Corbin Pike's story, which, when set beside Osric's, made a set of rails the train of truth could travel on. Sheriff Moxley walked that train into the courthouse with a steadiness that came from living here long enough to have seen the inside of other trains. The hearing fell on a Wednesday, the second week of October, the year 2003, written in the clerk's ledger in longhand, because that was the tradition. The courtroom smelled like old books and the sweet pine of new benches. The judge was a woman from Summers County with eyes like a hawk's when the hawk is hungry. Lucan sat near the back with Etta and Osric. Corbin Pike sat nowhere. He was never found. The diary had ended in winter and never resumed. Rumor said he left for Illinois. Another rumor said he worked on boats in Louisiana and stopped writing forever, which is a kind of leaving. Osric spoke first. He told the judge about the night in May, the rain, the red jacket, the ride offered and accepted, the long silence that followed. He did not ask for forgiveness because forgiveness is not a thing you request in a courthouse. He asked only that the truth be let to stand where it had been trying to stand for so long. The attorney's questions were precise, designed to shave the truth to scraps. Had Osric been fully sober the night he saw the truck? He had not had a drink in months, he said. Was he sure it was Ruth Ellen? He was as sure as a man can be after a lifetime of being unsure. Why did he not come forward earlier? Because fear, because rent, because men like Thaddeus Holt made livelihoods into leashes. He did not dress the answer, he let it go bare. Etta spoke, called as a custodian of the diary for the purposes of chain of custody. She testified to how the diary came into her library, how she recognized names within it, how she brought it under her care until she could place it into the hands of the law. She was the only witness who made the attorney blink without knowing why. It was something about the way she said the word dear once when describing a note in the margin, as if she were speaking directly to the absent dead and the absent diarist both at once. Then the forensic consultant spoke, careful, unsentimental. The bone fragment, he said, was human and consistent with a girl of Ruth Ellen's age. The bracelet had traces of the same clay found in the hollow shelf, and that clay came from limestone pockets particular to that section of Holtland. The bobcat tracks showed signs of being used to move heavy loads near the shelf in past years. The taillight evidence was circumstantial, he admitted, but in the human world, he added, gently, there are times when the word circumstantial is only a synonym for the patience of facts. Thaddeus Holt did not speak. He sat with his hands folded, his thumbnail pressed into his middle finger until the nail went white. The judge's decision was narrow and wide at once. She ordered Holt held without bail pending a full trial. She ordered the quarry site secured as a scene. She ordered a search of Holt's property for any personal effects of Ruth Ellen. She spoke to Osric without taking off her robe voice. She said that the court recognized the courage it takes to speak late and would not consider lateness as a means to disqualify the truth. She said the word truth as if it had weight. The trial came in late winter, when the mountains were all bone and wind. The jury listened to all the words. They listened to the way silence had shaped the town. They listened to a tape of Ruth Ellen reading a poem from a high school anthology found by a music teacher who had kept old programs in a shoebox. The tape was hiss, and then a clear young voice sang a line about water-keeping secrets it never meant to. Half the courtroom cried then, quietly, the way people cry when a thing they loved and thought lost walks back in wearing its own face. The verdict came down on a Friday afternoon in March, the year written in letters on the clerk's sheet the way Etta had asked, because she believed numbers were too curt for the heart. Guilty of manslaughter in the first degree, the jury said, and guilty of concealment of a body, and guilty of obstruction. The court could not say where the girl's mortal remains lay, and the court could not subtract from the years already passed, like water in a trench, but the court could put a man behind a door and say that the door would hold for a measured span. Pine Hollow reacted the way small towns do when justice comes late. The feed store stayed open an extra hour that night. The diner served pie on the house to anyone who remembered the poster on the bulletin board. Ruth Ellen's mother, older now and quieter, stood by the cedar tree in her yard and touched the rope with a hand that had done hard work. She told Etta that the bracelet had been given for a birthday long ago, and that she had sewed the button with the flower the week before the girl vanished, and that she had dreamed year after year of a hollow under rock and could not say it without feeling foolish. Lucan walked the ridge at dusk in April. The valley put on its fog like it always had, a habit it would keep after every human name had gone soft. He thought about Corbin Pike and his inability to finish, about the way some lives are a sentence that will not turn into a period, no matter how the speaker tries. He thought about Osric Vale and the slow courage that can take a lifetime to ripen. He thought about Etta, who tended not just books, but the municipality of memory. He let the wind pass through his coat. He sat on the split rock, which a tree root had shouldered out of alignment since that long ago year. He said quietly, a name. He said it once and then again. There was no charm in the saying. There was only the small act of putting the correct shape into the air. On a Thursday in May, the sheriff's office held a simple service near the quarry. A pine box, empty but symbolic, was lowered into a garden of wildflowers that school children planted along the fence. Ruth Ellen's mother stood with her hand on the wood. Osric Vale stood nearby with his cap off, speaking to no one, his eyes on the hollow where he had first bent, and found a life's last circle of silver. Etta read a poem in a voice that did not wobble. Lucan kept to the edge, as was his habit, a finder at the border of found and still lost. After the service, he drove to the little church outside Raynell, the one with the leaning steeple where he had first found the satchel under the pew. He wanted to thank a place for being the place where a thing had shifted. He parked and stood under the eaves as rain began, not in storm, but in a soft, competent fall. He went inside. The air smelled like hymnals and dust. He knelt by the last bench and checked beneath it, not expecting anything, only repeating the movement as one repeats a prayer that once worked. He found a single object lodged against the legging of the pew. It was a pocket watch. The case was brass with a scratch like a small comet. The hinge was loose. When he opened it, the face was fractured and yet still legible. The brand was Hamilton. The second's hand had stuttered to a stop at a stubborn place between 9 and 10. Inside the back cover was an engraving. The lettering had been done by an amateur, careful and slightly crooked. It read, "In thin letters and without dates, keep time for those who cannot." Lucan closed the watch gently. He sat a while with it resting warm in his palm. Then he rose and drove the winding road back into town. He stopped at the library because the library had become his way of ending and beginning days. Etta looked up when he came in and saw the watch. She did not ask where it had been. He set it on the reference desk, and they watched it as if it might choose to tick again. It did not. That was fine. The diary rested on the desk beside it, now in a plastic sleeve for the sake of the archivist who would eventually request it. Etta had tucked a slip of paper inside the sleeve with a note for the future. Found by Lucan Merritt in a church near Raynell on the 3rd of October, year written out in words for the sake of the heart, brought to the library, handed to the law. May it help the next person who is trying to tell the truth with a poor mouth. Lucan left the watch in Etta's care because she was good at tending the tools people leave behind when they run out of ways to finish. He walked back outside into a spring that had decided finally to pry winter loose. The wind moved through the oaks. He thought about how time does not heal anything. People do, sometimes late, sometimes imperfectly. Sometimes with a diary and a bracelet and a town deciding that the old way of keeping quiet was not the way they would go forward. That evening, long after the library lamps had been turned down, Sheriff Adela Moxley drove up to the Pike farm. The blue house had been taken over by blackberry cane, and the cedar had grown thick arms. She opened the gate with the respect you give to places that have sat through too much. She walked to the back stoop where Corbin Pike's mother had once shelled peas, and she laid a single sheet of paper on the step. It was a copy of the court's decision, written in plain language, names and dates and letters, no numbers. She laid a stone on top of it so the wind would not take the words away. Then she stood a moment, and she said, "Into the small, listening dark," the sentence that closed the story at last. "We have found what we could," she said. "We have done what we can. Rest." In Pine Hollow, the creek kept moving like it always had. The quarry, secured and quiet now, held the sky without flinching. People spoke Ruth Ellen's name without pinning it to a wish. Osric Vale slept through the night for the first time in years, and woke to a morning where the light came through the blind in stripes and made the room look like a page. Etta stamped the library's daily sheet and slipped the diary into the archive drawer with a sigh that was not grief so much as completion. Lucan Merritt went back to his habit of picking up a glove from a bus station bench and returning it, handing a lost grocery list to a young father who looked like he might cry over ruined plans, pocketing nothing except the feeling that sometimes the world would let you put one true thing back where it belonged. The watch never ticked again. That, too, was fine. It sat under glass near the county map, beside the diary, the bracelet, the photocopy of the missing person report with the word unknown crossed out in neat pen and the name Ruth Ellen Farn written beside it in Etta's careful script. People paused there. They read a line. They touched the glass with 2 fingers. They breathed in peppermint tea or coal dust or rain, depending on the hour and the day. Next stories. Camper vanished after seeing mysterious forest lights. They said the sky was clear over Plumas County the night it happened, the air so cold it seemed to ring when you breathed. It was late October of 2015, a weeknight that never made the news until it did, and the moon rose like a brass coin above the ponderosa pines. The forest had put on its quiet coat. Creeks whispered under skim ice. Mule deer moved with their shy clockwork steps. Owls traded questions from ridge to ridge. Everything was in its place. Then came the lights. His name was Talbot Hargreave, though most folks called him Tall. A lean man in his late 30s with a crow's stride and a carpenter's hands, Tal preferred old canvas over technical fabrics, coffee boiled black over any bottled energy. He was not a reckless romantic. On the contrary, he had always camped as if the forest graded him. He packed out what he packed in, left stones as he found them, planned his routes, left notes under magnets on the fridge. He worked in a small-town restoration shop in Quincy, and on weekends he ghosted the logging roads in an aging marigold truck, hunting for the kind of quiet that reminds you your heart is more than a metronome. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Mariella Quince, who ran the coffee window on Crescent Street, remembered the morning he left. He bought a cinnamon bun, asked for a second cup sleeve, and grinned at the early chill. He was headed toward Bucks Lake and beyond, he said, to a spur road he had memorized by the way the wind sounded in the dogwoods. He had a map folded twice. He had an orange-knobbed compass. He had an old Nikon. He would be back by Saturday night. He would bring her a picture of a stump shaped like a crown. The lake was flat glass by late afternoon. Tal parked at the turnout, shouldered a faded pack, and started up Bluebird Shelf, a bench of granite above the water. His plan was simple. He would make camp beneath a ring of firs before the trail tipped into the darker miles. He would sleep, rise early, and step into the high meadow to watch the first frost loosen from stiff grass. He had no heroics on the docket. He wanted a sunrise, and the drift of ravens, and maybe the shine of an old insulator in the dirt. The way he told friends, he was going to count the colors the world could be when nobody wanted anything from him. By twilight, he had a small fire going in a legal pit near a stone with a cleft that looked like a grin. He set up the weathered khaki tent, the one with a scar near the door that he had sewn with dental floss years ago. He brewed a tin cup of coffee, tilted in a fingertip of whiskey, and listened. The dark came on like a slow-held breath. Coyotes tuned up along the distant ridgeline, then let the song go quiet again. Tal pulled on a knit cap. He hummed. He drummed fingers on the metal cup, a patient beat. The rhythm of someone who knows the forest is not a show put on for him, who does not clap for a curtain to rise. Shortly after, he zipped himself inside the tent. The first light arrived. At first, he thought it was a distant hiker's headlamp cutting through trees with that white, impatient swing, but the beam was wrong. It did not fan out or stumble. It moved behind the trunks as if the trunks were glass, a roundness of pale that seemed to breathe. It crossed the hollow to the east, stopped, widened, and thinned, like a coin held on edge and then flat. Tal lay on his side and watched its edges blur against the night. He could not hear anything. No footfalls, no whisper of brush, only the river's cold silk and the faint snap of cooling rocks. He told himself the story you tell yourself when something is strange but you are alone. It was a hunter crossing the lower spur. It was a drone, one of those quiet toys. It was a miner's lantern left swinging on an old pin and caught by a breeze. The light took a breath. Then it blinked out. Tal waited, as you would. He tucked his chin deeper into the wool. He counted 30 breaths. He felt the sleep that comes after miles slide over him like a heavy blanket. He let it. The second light woke him near midnight. This one was closer. It lifted from the creek and burned as steady as a candle inside glass. It did not throw shadows. That was the first thing that unsettled him. He raised his palm and saw no crisp darkness on the tent wall. He listened for mosquitoes and heard none. The light paused somewhere near the fire ring, as if considering the circle of ash. Then it rose by a hand's breadth and made a delicate turn, no sound of foot, no drag of chain. It did not ring any of the bells the mind uses to stay calm. Tal whispered a word he would not remember later. His mouth went dry, the light drifted toward the tent. There is a moment in some nights when the air feels like a hallway and you feel both inside and outside your life. Tal opened the zipper a hand's width. Cold slid in like a knife. The light hovered beyond the flap. Close! It was not a ball, but a shape, like a slow heart, pulsing small, then full, a pale amber that carried a low hum that was not a hum, more the memory of one. Tal put his face to the gap and inhaled the scent of wet stone and metal warmed by sun, though the sun had long since left. The light answered by shrinking, then brightening, then pulling itself into a thin thread and slipping past his line of sight. Tal felt something like relief. He felt something like being counted. He lay back. He pulled the wool over his chest. He told himself that he should mark the hill with a rock arrow in the morning, write the time in his small notebook so he did not let the forest rearrange his memory. He should go back to sleep. He should watch the light if it returned. He should not invite it. In Quincy, the clock on the courthouse ticked toward the stomach hours, the ones no one claims. In the tent, Tal's breath evened out. In the trees, the unseen made its slow arithmetic. What the searchers later learned from tracks in disturbed moss suggested that Tal stepped out a little before one. Somewhere between one sound and another, the light came back, brighter and farther away, on the lower slope by a snag. The night had that deep cold quiet that makes a single snap twig travel like glass breaking. Tal stepped into his boots without lacing. He slid his arms into a jacket. If he took the camera, no one found it later. If he took the compass, it was not recovered. He whispered again, this time his own name, and then he whispered another, a name he did not use for anything, as if he were trying something out in the air. He stood in the open, so still that frost began to slick his hair. The light lowered until it almost kissed the ground, as if inviting. It stretched into an oval, then into a strange narrow mouth of brightness. Then it returned to its slow heart. It turned once, the way a bird will turn mid-air to remeasure a wind. Tal took 3 steps downhill. In the morning, Mariella Quince would get out of bed with the feeling she had left some appliance running. She would sniff for heat, touch the stovetop, check the iron, pace the rooms, then laugh softly at herself and pour the batter for pancakes. She would stand at the window with a spatula and watch a raven ride a thermal like a thought. She would tell herself she was thinking of a friend because it was Saturday. Before dawn, the cold deepened into a grit that crackled underfoot. The light floated sideways, a slow, patient walk. Tal followed at a distance that felt like letting a shy dog lead him to something it wanted to show, but would bolt if he rushed. He went past the grinstone, past his fire circle, across a small spill of scree where his boots scraped softly. He should have turned back, where the duff thinned and the old burn began. But the light kept its steady hallway pace, and Tal, who had raised barns and driven through mountain storms and felt sure of his place among living things, could not convince himself that he was not being asked a question. If he had shouted then, the sound would have landed in empty miles. If he had thrown a rock, he would have learned whether the light was a lantern, a trick, a man. He did neither. He picked his steps, held his breath, and followed as if on a slow rope. The light glided down into an old wagon road, cleft into the slope so long ago that lichen had taken title to the ruts. Ferns had grown and sealed and grown again. The oak skeletons on the cut bank raised their hands, as if surrendering in permanent silence. He came to the road and stopped. The light had paused there as well. It seemed to rest, exactly where the ruts were deepest, just past a small cairn the color of old tea. Tal tasted rust and thought of the nails he kept in coffee cans. He thought of how they looked when the afternoon sun lit the dust above his workbench. His throat tightened. He did not know why until he realized he was grieving something he had not lost yet. Here is how the deputy wrote it in the report. Later. Choose your own slow breath before you read it aloud. The tracks proceed down the old wagon road 15 to 20 yards, grow irregular, then stop. The ground past the wagon ruts is undisturbed. The rocks on either side of the ruts are unturned. No sign of a slide or sink, no drag marks, no animal prints. The pine needles forward of the last boot print are undisturbed and lightly frosted. No signs of a scuffle, no blood, no debris, no camera, no pack, no sign of struggle. The prints end. Tal did not come back to his tent. The fire ring stayed neat, the coffee tin sat where he had left it, the map was on the stump with a pine cone as a paperweight, the tent zipper was half down, a moth had become a small white leaf near the lantern and then fallen. By late morning, a fisherman noticed the unattended camp. He walked a short distance down the slope and called, not loudly, because folks in the mountains do not believe in shouting names unless it is necessary. When he got no answer, he called a second time. The third time, his voice thinned. He looked around, saw the boot prints, followed them to the wagon road, and found the place where they ended like a sentence cut short with a blank page. He did the correct thing. He did not play detective. He walked back to the truck turnoff and drove out until his phone found a skiff of service. He told the dispatcher what he had seen and what he had not. He used the word strange only once. He used the word quiet 3 times without noticing. Search teams came with maps folded into quarters and dog teams that padded over the frosted trails and breathed white. They brought a portable repeater and strung it from a mast so their radios could do the trick of making one voice happen in many places at once. They brought cloth flags on wire stems colored pink and orange, the kind you stick at corners when you want to remember where the corners are. They brought clipboards. They walked in lines, took careful steps, and did not trample the wagon road. By late afternoon, they had all agreed on 2 facts that fought each other. Talbot Hargreave had walked from his tent to the wagon road, and then the world forgot how to take his weight. A deputy named Orrin Pike squatted with knees popping and pressed a gloved hand to the last print, as if he might hear the heat of it. Then he rose, turned slowly, and scanned the trees as if they might explain themselves. They searched the creek cut and the limestone karst. They rapped on the hollows that formed in the old lava bubbles and waited, then rapped again. They sent a team toward the talus and another toward the meadow. They called his name with the gravity of men and women who know the mountain listens even when it does not answer. The dogs worked tirelessly and then sat down with the puzzled grace of good dogs when the scent went nowhere at the ruts. At dusk, the mountain changed its mind about the light. The first stars came like pinpricks in canvas. The temperature fell fast. A ranger with a face like a kindly axe suggested they break, warm up, then go again with headlamps until midnight. In the deep blue before the last light died, 2 volunteers on the East Spur saw what they later called a lantern without a lantern, a soft gold moving slowly where a person would have to walk sideways through brush. They raised their hands to shade their eyes, though there was nothing to shade from. They watched the light pause, thin and sway like something remembering a dance. They were tired, they were cold. They kept watching until the light moved behind a screen of firs and did not come out the other side. The report notes their statement but brackets it with a word that men write when they do not want to be cruel. Anecdotal. In town, Mariella kept the window open past her usual hour. She propped the door and listened for the Marigold truck. She told herself the lake roads could be slow. She told herself the map fold he trusted might have torn free from his pocket. She told herself the forest sometimes asked for a little more time. When the last customer left, she wiped the counter twice, then twice again. The lights above the espresso machine made a faint hum, the kind that tells your teeth a story you cannot hear. She switched them off. The place felt suddenly bigger. The second day, the light snow that threatens but never commits in early mountain winter made a cameo. Flakes appeared and then decided not to. The search teams broadened their grid. A plane from a neighboring county made lazy ladders above the slopes as a spotter peered through glass. A reporter from Reno asked a question about missing hikers and statistics, then asked a second, softer question about hope. The second was not recorded. The deputy with knees that popped walked the wagon road again and again until the place felt like a museum you do not want to be left alone in. On the third evening, something happened that the team did not file because they did not know how to file it. The dogs, tired but still willing, began to whine toward the creek and then fell silent, ears forward. The air felt brilliant and thin. The frost that had not yet formed on the low grasses flashed silver and then dull again. One of the searchers, Keaton Vale, lifted his chin as if sniffing a storm. Later, he would say that the smell was not like rain or snow or tree, but like penny metal and warm glass, a scent he did not associate with the forest. The feeling did not last. It arrived and folded itself away. Keaton thought of reverence without wanting to. The sheriff met with the family. He stood, hat in hand, and talked in a steady voice about statistics, outcomes, windows of survival. He said the word hypothermia carefully, as if it had corners. Tal's sister listened without blinking, then asked if the wagon road had ever been used for anything other than hauling lumber. The sheriff said yes, and then he said no, the way people do when a thing has had more than one truth across its life. He said the road may have seen other kinds of traffic. He did not say smuggling or mining or midnight. He did not say lights. He did say that they would not stop looking until the looking had been done right. On the fourth day, clouds came low and made the hills feel closer. The team decided to draw in, rest crews, review what they knew. They brought the map into the warming tent and pinned corners with mugs. The wagon road was a small line on the big paper, a ghost of a path in a forest of contour rings. The last boot print was a brown dot in a loop of red pencil. The tent site was a small square. A few notes in the margins recorded the ordinary things that search maps often hold. Stumps that looked like men, hollow with owl, disturbance from bear. These ordinary fragments tried to argue the world was still the same, but the red loop at the wagon rut insisted otherwise. In the middle of that day, an older man walked into the search post. He wore a hat as old as the hat band and a coat that had known every kind of weather north of Sacramento. He introduced himself as Ilias Moro. He tapped the brim of his hat to each person the way people do when they learned manners before the new century. He said he had worked on the railroad in his youth, hauled timber later, and then run a bait shop that folded when the freeway did what freeways do. He said he had not hiked Bluebird Shelf in many years, but knew the wagon road when it was still almost a road. He said he had once seen a light there. Voices quieted without anyone asking for quiet. Ilias said it had been just after the war of a different century, late autumn, a cold night when the lake lay flat as old burnished silver. He had walked down the wagon road with a friend who wanted to check snares he had set for rabbits. They had joked and spat and walked side by side. Then the light rose from the ruts and made a slow turn, the way a fish makes a thought just under water. It had not frightened them at first. It had moved like something living and careful. When they stepped toward it, it stepped away. When they stopped, it paused. Ilias had felt the hair along his arm stand, a slow wave. He had felt the strange relief of being noticed by something that owed him nothing, the oldest feeling, like seeing lightning and feeling the earth say, "Yes, you are here too." His friend had moved, perhaps a half step too quick. The light had thinned, brightened, and slid backward down the ruts. When they followed, it had climbed like a slow bubble and stepped into the trees where there were no tracks to serve as its floor. They had watched it until it grew small and the cold began to speak again. They had never spoken of it afterward, not because it had terrified them, but because it had felt like a thing you do not add words to without taking something away. Ilias lifted his hat, held it to his chest, and said he had dreamed of the light 3 times in his long life, and each dream had left him with a sweetness he could not describe. He wondered if perhaps Tal had seen the same. The sheriff thanked him and did not write a report. Some things you file in a box with a different lock. On the 6th day, they found the Nikon. It lay under manzanita leaves on a bench above the wagon road, a place already searched, which made the finding uneasy. The camera's strap was cracked with age and weather, but its back was intact. When they brought it into the warming tent, set it on the map, and opened it, the last photograph revealed a circle of trees lit as if from within. No shadows. The bark looked like paper lit from behind. A human figure was not visible. Neither was the light itself, only the consequence of it. The photo before that showed a rock on the creek with black moss and a sienna smear of mineral vein. The photo before that showed the tent flap. The last light came through in the print like a held note. The film was old, not digital. They could not simply pull more images from a card, dive deeper into metadata, parse timestamps. The camera did not offer the conveniences that make a life feel organized. They held the photograph with hands that had tugged many ropes and lifted many lost things and drew no conclusions except the one no one wanted. Tal had been there. He had photographed something that painted the trees with light. He had then gone where his boots could not leave a record. There are stories that fray when you pull and stories that tighten. This one tightened. In town, people said the quiet parts out loud in the soft ways they use for one another. They said the world is bigger than the tools we bring to measure it. They said the mountain remembers who we are, even when we forget. They said Tal was stubborn and would not wander without deciding to. They said his smile had a small hitch in it, like a bird adjusting on a branch. They said he brought small gifts to friends who did not realize they needed them, like a perfect river stone or a screw he had filed to fit a stripped hinge. They said a great many things that sounded like blessings disguised as facts. Mariella closed early on the 7th day. She brought the caffeine monster machine down with its sighs and clicks. She set a cup on the counter like a little altar and turned it upside down. She stood, hands on the wood, and said Tal's name once in a voice you use when you are not inviting anyone else to hear you. Then she put on a sweater, locked the door, walked to the lake road, and drove until the pavement narrowed and the trees leaned in. She parked where the fishermen had parked and stepped onto the trail the way a person steps onto the floor after moving furniture and you forget the room's old shape. The sky was the deep blue that ends a story you liked reading. She followed pink flags and orange flags that fluttered as if the wind did not quite understand them. She passed the grindstone. She passed the tent circle. She came to the wagon road and stood at the rim of the ruts. She did not step down. She lifted her eyes and looked along it as if it might carry a faint shine. The air stilled. A small bird made a single curious sound and then thought better of it. Without wind, the trees became an audience. Mariella inhaled deeply, and the scent of cold water and iron rose as if the creek had suddenly pulled itself closer. She lifted her hand as if to shade her eyes, though there was nothing to shade. Then she saw it. It was not bright, it was not a miracle. It was a presence the size of a heart and the color of warm honey held in a jar. It rose slowly from the ruts as if waking. It did not throw a shadow. It did not glow on her skin. It regarded her the way a deer regards you when it wants to learn whether you are crossing paths or making one. Mariella's breath left her in a soft "oh" that did not ask and did not answer. She took a half step toward the ruts and then stopped. The light brightened and thinned. A whisper moved up the old road, a hush that had nothing to do with wind. The hair on her arms lifted. She felt a sudden, irrational certainty that if Tal could see this, he would laugh and say, "Now you know." The light held. It did not retreat and did not advance. It pulsed, small then full, as steady as the hand of someone counting a child to sleep. Mariella did what she had not known she would do. She lowered her hand, bowed her head as if in church, and spoke his name once. The light quivered with a response so subtle she could not say whether it moved or whether her eyes made it so. Then it drew itself small, a bead of amber caught mid-air and slid back down into the ruts, as if the earth had persuaded it to rest again. Mariella stood for a very long time. She did not call to it, she did not beg, she did not weep. She waited until the last blue drained from the sky and the stars arrived to begin their unpaid work. Then she turned, walked back along the flags that still did not understand where they were, and drove to town. She did not tell anyone that night. She did not know what to do with the new shape the world had taken, except carry it gently and place it next to the older shapes and let them learn to sit together. She slept without dreams and woke with a certainty that had no edges. The searchers returned once more the next week, fewer now, with heavier steps and fewer flags. They checked the ruts again, the creek, the clefts, the caves. They found nothing new, which is not the same as nothing. They took down the mast. They signed their names on the back of a map before the sheriff rolled it tight. They packed up the warming tent and turned the ground back to the ground. Winter came early that year. It arrived as a patient, insistent hand, laying white cloths over the stone, tucking cold into the hollows, polishing the black bark. The lake took a skin of ice and learned to speak again only when the afternoons were warmer. Elk passed with the gravity of creatures that never ask permission. Owls resumed their voting. The light in the wagon road, if it rose, rose for no one or for someone who did not write it down. The mountains do not submit logs. In Quincy, the restoration shop went on, the sawdust drifting through beams of light that cut the air into rooms. There were chairs to repair and the desk that never quite stopped squeaking. The Marigold truck stayed in its lot longer than trucks like that prefer. In late winter, a friend of Tal's started it once and let it run, then shut it off and leaned his head on the wheel with his eyes closed. You could make a prayer out of that sound if you wanted, the engine steadying and then letting go. Spring came with its oversized ambition. On a day when the alder tossed catkins like confetti, Mariella carried a paper envelope to the lake road and tucked it under a rock near the grindstone. Inside were three small things. The first was a photograph of her window in the morning when the first sun came through the steamed glass. It looked like a lake trying on the sky for size. The second was a black screw filed down to fit a stripped hinge Tal would have approved. The third was a letter only 2 sentences long, which she had written by hand with a pen that liked to blot. It said, "I saw it. And if there is a way to learn the language it speaks, I will learn it without asking it to say too much." In late summer, a hiker from Oroville took a photo of a slow light on the far slope as dusk slurred day into night. The photo never made the paper. It lived on a phone as a story people tell on porches when the air is kind and the cicadas sing. The hiker's voice did not climb into drama when he told it. He only said it was like watching a thought move through the trees that was not his thought, and he had never envied a thought before. Years settle. They thicken and then thin like seasons that forgot their order. The calendar pages flutter. The sheriff retires. The deputy with the popping knees buys a second-hand boat. Ilias Moro moves to his daughter's house down below and dies in a chair in late spring with a smile on his face. A smile his daughter calls a sunrise he decided to keep. The bait shop, long closed, collapses under one of those winds that decide old things are beautiful but need less standing. Mariella keeps the coffee window, then sells it to a kid who plays good music too loud, then opens a smaller place with fewer choices where the menu fits in a single breath. She learns to make bread that forgives her on bad days. On a mild October night many years later, the town hall hosts a talk about the trails. A ranger points to maps and speaks in a steady voice that makes complicated things feel arranged. A small display in the back shows found items from search efforts over the years. A compass, a bootlace, a blue cap with a white letter. On the table lies Tal's Nikon, not as evidence or trophy, but as a tool that once did its job well. The last photo of lit trees sits beside it in a frame Mariella made in the back room, the wood sanded smooth as a river stone. People who never met him pause. They lower their heads slightly, the way people do when they are the kind of people who lower their heads at the right times. They move on. As for the lights, there are those who will always file them as folly, a trick of cold air and the brain's deep tendency to complete the story before the last scene plays. There are others who will climb that wagon road with a kinder vocabulary, palms open, minds gentle, asking nothing. Most will find only trees that keep their counsel and a creek that never changes the subject. A few will smell warm glass and cold air and feel the skin of the world lift as if remembering something, then settle again. What is certain is simple and hard. Talbot Hargreave walked from his tent on a clear night in the high Sierras, late October of 2015, toward a light that moved as if thinking. He stepped onto an old road, cut into the slope by men who wanted one thing and made, by accident, a place that can hold another. He followed the light a little way. His boot prints ended. His leaving did not. The mountain kept its quiet coat. The owl called and was answered. The creek went on practicing its single song. The wagon road became, in time, only a dimmer line in the understory, a thought half forgotten that can be remembered if you catch it sideways. If you go there, go with a slow heart. Do not demand a history. Bring a thermos and a good word for the trees. Sit a while and let the hill decide whether to notice you. If a light rises, do not chase. If it does not, give thanks for the sort of world where both outcomes are possible without requiring a verdict. Mariella, who sees the seasons roll like patient wheels, sometimes drives to the turnoff and walks to the grindstone. She does it without ceremony. She sits and listens. She speaks his name softly once and then tells him what the bread did that day, how the first loaf came out with a shy curve, how the second rose in a way that made the kitchen smell like a promise coming true. She does not ask for anything in return. She tells him where the ravens nested this year and how one feather lay perfect on the sidewalk. She tells him the lake wore the sky like a coat. When she is done, she places her palm on the rock. Sometimes the cold bites. Sometimes she feels a faint warmth find her skin, the way a hand finds another in a crowded room. Then she stands, brushes pine duff from her pants, and walks back toward the truck as the first stars prick the evening. Next stories. Kidnapped girl outsmarts serial killer to survive. Bitter Creek Road, Wyoming. How Leora Penn outsmarted a serial killer and lived, The night began with a wind that came down from the high country like a warning, dry and restless, tumbling sage and dust across a two-lane ribbon of asphalt called Bitter Creek Road. It was Thursday, September the 12th, 2019, a little past 9 in the evening, when Leora Penn turned off the interstate and toward the quiet lights of a town that wore its name like a shrug. Red Butte, Wyoming. She was driving a sun-faded sedan that coughed whenever the grade rose. Her hands on the wheel were steady, even as the sky grumbled, even as the radio lost its station to static and distance. Leora had been on the road since sunrise, crossing the spine of the West with a suitcase and